years ago and consists of at least 13 individuals. They have been identified as dog both based on DNA. They're related to the American dog lineage. They're not part of the American dog lineage, but they're really closely related. They're basal to it. And based on morphology, they are dogs. The shape of their skull, and I believe some of their teeth indicates that they are dogs. And based on other elements found at this site, particularly harness pieces, the authors, Bidulko and Kasparov, the author of that project, have argued that the dogs were sled dogs. But when we go back to the Pleistocene, there is very little information about the dogs in the archaeological record of Beringia. Famously, there is a burial of a large canid at Ushki Lake in Kamchatka, which was interpreted as being a dog, and is dated to about 12,600 years ago. But as far as we know, the bones were not collected because they were not preserved, so it's hard to make anything more from that specimen, more than the picture we have of it. In eastern Beringia, there is a known large canid specimen in the Middle Tanana Valley, at Broken Mammoth, that is unstudied so far. From the picture, we can see that it appears to have a fresh breakage. And it dates to about the same time period, 12,000 years ago. There are two other specimens with very little information on, one from McDonald Creek in Alaska that is under study and was reported in the SAA archaeological record as a dog or a wolf, and dated to about 14,000 years ago. Also in the Middle Tanana Valley, a little downstream. And one specimen from Britannia Creek in the Upper Yukon Valley in the Yukon, with one tooth dated to about 13,000 years ago, which was destroyed for dating, and as far as I'm aware, there's no picture available. One last specimen is from the site of Little John in the Yukon in the Upper Tanana Valley. It consists of humerus in a component that's dated to 14 to 13,000 years ago. From the picture, it appears to have a carnivore ravaging on one end, on the proximal end, but there is no organic preservation, so it has not been directly dated. There's no isotope or DNA information from it. So here in this talk, we report information on additional specimens of large canids from the Middle Tanana Valley. One is from the site of Swan Point. It consists of a left tibia fragment in the CZ4B occupation, so dated by association. We don't have a direct date on it, to about 14,000 years ago. It's associated with the CZ4B occupation, which we have has been interpreted as a Mammoth ivory workshop, and specifically the specimen is located in or near an ivory trash pile. It also bears evidence of carnivore gnawing on it. Further up valley at the site of Hollenbach's Hill, we have recovered through excavations there the paw of a large canid, the front paw. It's not technically articulated, but many of the elements of that paw are present in close proximity to each other, so I would say it's loosely articulated. And the context of this find is not clear. It's possibly associated with a human occupation. We have very little archaeological evidence from that component, but it's on a paleosol, and it's associated with freshly broken ungulate bones. We have a direct date on this specimen, just a little bit younger than the Swan Point specimen. And the isotope information from this individual indicate a diet that is probably similar to what we know about the wolf diet at that time in Alaska. Another component at that site, we're not in the Pleistocene anymore, we're in the Holocene, but we have recovered a mostly complete skeleton of an individual. And when I mean complete, we we have most big elements, but this is a perinate, meaning that it's a late-stage fetus or a neonate, a newborn individual. And all these elements are pretty small, so we definitely missed some of them. Probably some of these elements are not even ossified at that stage in life. And we only recovered one germ of a tooth, very fragile, very small germ of a milk tooth, but probably the other teeth, either we did not recover or they did not preserve. This individual was identified by a DNA analysis. It's associated with an archaeological component, and specifically with an anthropogenic feature that's dated to about 8,000 years ago. And it's associated with a lot of other faunal materials that include gnawed bones of elk or wapiti, as well as non-gnawed elements of a range of other species, birds, beaver, and songbirds, chickadee and junco, I believe, as well as fish. Some of that fish has evidence of consumption by humans or carnivore because the elements are digested. The isotope information from that specimen is very different from the previous one. It indicates that the mother, when the mother was providing the nutrients for the ossification of these bones, so in utero, was eating salmon at that time. This consumption of salmon probably explains the discrepancy in date that we observe between the direct date on that specimen and the date of the context through a marine reservoir effect. That's about a little more than 1,000 calendar years difference. We conducted a DNA analysis on these 3 specimens. At one point, we were able to recover a large amount of the mitochondrial genome and a small amount of the nuclear genome. And these 2 pieces of information are in agreement, and that specimen clusters with Eurasian wolves. At the site of Hollenbach, we were not able to recover any DNA from the old specimen. We did recover DNA from the new specimen because that's what enabled us to ascertain that it was a large canid. And we're in the process of determining whether it clusters with a wolf population or dog populations, known lineage at that time. If it's a wolf, it has interesting implications because wolves are usually born in April or May, so it would imply that the mother was eating salmon before that in March or April, and there's no salmon in the Tanana that time of the year. It's a late summer or early fall thing today. So it could imply, if it's a wolf again, that the mother was feeding on a stored salmon, possibly scavenging human occupations. So what do we know about human-canid relationships in Beringia based on these sites? And we can see that large canids are present at a significant proportion of late Pleistocene and early Holocene sites. So we have clear dogs by 9,000, 8,000 years ago at Joukov Island. We know that from morphology and DNA. Possibly we have a dog at Hollenbach, and additional evidence for this would be the fact that they're eating fish, salmon. There is relatively little evidence for Pleistocene dogs so far, and that evidence is ambiguous. The burial of an individual at Ushki, the presence of gnawing at numerous archaeological sites at that time. And I think this leads us with 3 hypotheses for interpreting ecological relationships between human and canids at that time. One is that all the canids at that time are dogs, which it would mean that the canid at the site of Swan Point is not related to any other dog lineages that we know of, which is probably unlikely, but possible. Another hypothesis is that all the canids except Joukov are wolves, and in this case we are seeing intensive relationship between human and wolves, which includes probably a combination of predation, commensality, and ritual treatment, so burial of individuals. And the third hypothesis, probably the most likely, is that both dogs and wolves are present during that period. And that what we are saying is that the complex relationships, both ecological relationships and reproduction relationships between humans, wolves, and dogs throughout that period. And something that we know from the ethnographic record occurred until pretty recent times in the north of North America. I want to thank you for your attention, acknowledge the funding for this research, the support of the Hollenbach family in our excavations at this site, and all the people who volunteered their time to excavate with us. And thanks. And I believe it is just 1 p.m., so we're going to move to the next presentation, which is Brian. Brian, can you share your screen? There you go.
Is it sharing the proper screen?
Mammoth, Ivory, Roux, yeah, it is.
That would be it.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, François, for organizing us and organizing this session. I just want to get my timer started so I don't go over. I'm really excited to join you guys and talk about mammoth ivory rods from the Middle Tanana Valley in Alaska for today's presentation. Obviously, this region is central to the peopling of the Americas, and in the last year, there's been a fluorescence in research. These 3 books alone came out in the last 12 months or so, and along with all of the journal articles, there is a real strong favoring of the early coastal route and the peopling of the Americas. So it's great to read all this fluorescence and research and to see where things are going to go with the incorporation of ancient DNA, et cetera. But clearly one thing we can agree on is that Beringia holds the key to these questions, even despite the disputes and the controversies and the arguments over what sites are where and how old they are. The source populations for the peopling of the Americas clearly originates in interior Siberia based on genetic and lithic data. There's also a very rich osseous tool tradition there by 30,000 years ago at the Yana RHS site, way up on number 23 there on the graph in Ian Bouvet, Kelly Graph and Ian Bouvet graphic here from 2017. Kelly and Ian really do a good job with the lithics of showing that this is where people came from, but also in Jennifer Rath's book and all the papers that have come out over the last 20 years, even Michael Crawford's book from 20 years ago or so argue that the genetic source of these populations is here in Siberia on the inland side. So looking at these mammoth ivory and antler tools in the absence of some diagnostic lithics could help us. And there is this rich tradition of ivory and mammoth working over there. So the argument is, did the people come by the coast, or was it an interior route during the late Pleistocene into the Americas? And there's a wave of new studies arguing for evidence for this early peopling. But if by sea, we would see evidence of an eastern migration inland, even if the original sites are under the water and under the continental shelf, we would see a migration from the west coast to the east into the interior. And we don't see that, even though, as Ben Potter has pointed out in recent papers and others, there are habitable refugia exposed along the coastline, particularly between 17 and 12,000 years ago. And those sites are not there in the unsubmerged sites. So there's still not this convincing evidence of a human settlement or land use. But I should also note we're lacking sites from the ice-free corridor as well. So this is unresolved, and I'm in a position that we don't know yet until there's definitive evidence one way or the other. Both routes were possible, according to Potter's 2018, with multiple models for the peopling of Americas possible. And he argues that both had habitats that were viable in these corridors. But all the early sites older than 13,000 years ago are in the interior and oriented towards mobile hunting and gathering and some fishing, but not maritime coastal adaptations. That argument has gone on for a long time. Arguments for earlier migrations along the coast sometimes source the original population around Hokkaido or northern Japan. And there are a lot of these possible pre-Clovis sites around the mid-continent with this coastal migration model. But there are problems with all of these and arguments for each of these sites for this ancient Hokkaido scenario. And the ADNA does strongly suggest an ancient northern Siberian source. So the archaeological evidence for a coastal migration is not there yet. After decades and decades of research, there's no uncontested archaeology anywhere along the coast older than 13,000 years ago. And that leaves us with the interior route and possibly this ice-free corridor. So Eastern Beringia is key to this story, and the Middle Tanana Valley so far has the best preserved record, as François highlighted and outlined. So we're looking for archaeological evidence for an initial colonization at the head of this possible interior route. We do have evidence between 14,100 and 12,500 cal BP with unquestionable evidence for a presence of people there, with multiple groups converging in interior Alaska at this point, time at the late glacial, with multiple technologies and different site types. There's upland and lowland subsistence and very strong evidence for different stages of human colonization that just isn't on the coastal areas up and down the West Coast. In the mid-continent, Clovis is part of this story. The earliest verifiable presence of people in the mid-continent dates roughly between 13,200 and 12,800 cal BP. And the fluted point distributions there and the radiocarbon dates support that the diagnostic Clovis points probably originated in the southeast or the southern plains and migrated north through the ice-free corridor. So the answer isn't among the fluted Clovis point traditions, because it would have developed among people that were already there. So the presence of these ivory rods among Clovis is telling, because it does show up there. And then also key is the opening of the ice-free corridor, which was viable by 14,000 years ago, according to recent studies. And we should be looking more at migratory waterfowl and smaller game as important food sources, and not necessarily megafauna. Because even at Shaw Creek, yeah, there's a little bit of mammoth hunting, but there's an awful lot of ducks being consumed, particularly at Holtzman, and I know at Broken Mammoth as well. So the extent of ice in these recent studies is helpful for understanding possible pathways. The same map, but instead of sites, with Clovis points, these are sites that have ivory and osseous rods with them, ivory and bone technologies depicted on the Western Hemisphere here with a blow up of the Shaw Creek region. With ancient Alaskan sites there in red in the Tanana Valley, and quite a few post-Clovis site, osseous type bone rods in Alaska as well. And in the mid-continent, the blue triangles there are Clovis era rods and points that are kind of scattered across the distribution of where you might find Clovis, but also out in the Great Basin where you might find stemmed points. There are these osseous types of rods. So ivory bones and rods is an upper Paleolithic technology, and it links the New World with ancestors in the Old World. And it's associated with late Pleistocene steppe environments in interior Asia and Europe. Some of them have these beveled ends, which I'll talk about later when we get to the Holtzman artifacts. In the Western Hemisphere, they're fairly rare, particularly at mid-continent, but they're not older than 13,000 years ago in the lower 48. The earliest in the Western Hemisphere are in the Tanana Valley along Shaw Creek. There are some at Broken Mammoth, which has a wide variety of different types, but also then at Holtzman, the recent discoveries. And these dates, sorry, my camera's in the way, these dates between 13,600 and 13,500 at Broken Mammoth and at Holtzman. So we know that before, these are not the oldest components in Shaw Creek, even before these components that had the ivory and osseous tools, people are harvesting mammoth ivory tusks. Some is ancient ivory and some is fresh ivory. And they're also using Paleolithic microblade diopti technology at Swan Point. But at Holtzman, we have mammoth tusk, a hearth, some lithic working, but no microblades at Holtzman. And these components date between 14,100 and 14,000 cal BP, both at Holtzman and at Swan Point. So what is the form and function of these rods? We can characterize and describe the form fairly easily. And the best paper on this is Sutton from 2018, Michael Sutton, but there are many papers on the forms of these and some papers on attempts or hypotheses for their function. But Sutton defines at least 4 different types that show up: the straight unibeveled rods, the straight bibeveled rods, which is probably most common among Clovis, curved unibeveled, and a bipointed point style or type 4. In cross section, these forms have different shapes as well that we can use to categorize and describe. There are round or oval or cylindrical. The literature varies between the 3, but they're more or less oval. These are commonly the bibeveled rods. There's the plano-convex rods that are split sort of longitudinally, kind of down the middle. We don't fully know why, something to do with function or hafting. They tend to be somewhat rectangular in cross section for whatever reason. The beveling is still a bit of a mystery, but it's something we can document. They tend to have 1 or 2 beveled ends, and commonly these range between 50 and 280 millimeters in terms of the length of the bevel, but they can be shorter than that too. Function is more difficult and purely hypothetical. Archaeologists are excellent at speculating, and this is all speculation. But some ideas that have been proposed over the decades are that there are obviously 4 shafts for projectile points and hafting. And actually, some of the bipointed ones like type 4 are really good at hafting on top of some of the other forms, like the East Wenatchee style. So there may be 2 that go together around a lithic projectile. Probably one of my favorites was, well, I first read about it in a paper by François, coincidentally, a wedge or a lever. And I say this because after a couple of weeks ago, trying to cut into a mammoth tusk to section its core for ancient DNA analysis, after cutting for a while with the Dremel, the best tool was a flat screwdriver to pry, and you can see this image by Patolko here showing it used as a wedge or a lever. If you think about cutting ivory for, say, bone needles, where you might incise it for a while and then stick in a pry bar, it'd be very useful to have something like that around. Sutton argues for fish spear components. It's interesting to me, maybe not so much for fish, but could be used for ducks, for nabbing ducks, depending on how it's constructed. Other ideas are pressure flakers or even sled runners. Has been around for a while, and somebody recently suggested hide working tools, and just essentially mentioned that anyone who has worked hide leather has used a tool similar to that before. Later forms are slotted or incised for microblades. Those tend to be more early Holocene in Alaska, and even in Siberia, those forms come a little later. So comparative between some of these rods with the Clovis era down south, as I mentioned, that they don't exceed 13,000 in the mid-continent, but the 4 oldest are Anzac in Montana, Sheridan Cave in Ohio, Blackwater Draw, New Mexico, and East Wenatchee has several of them in Washington State. And here's a chart that compares the length and the width, which is the most common way to compare them. In the paper, I reported on 77 known instances of these rods, but only 39 of those were complete or nearly complete enough that you could get a length measurement on the thing. and put it into this chart. And you can see where Holtzman falls sort of right next to the Sheridan Cave ones. They're kind of on the shorter and smaller end of this whole spectrum. And then you can also notice that Broken Mammoth, the 4 that are complete, are all over the place here, sort of surrounding the Anzac in terms of length and width. And it's interesting to note the Upward Sun River ones, how large they are in comparison. And they're also 2,000 years or so younger than, say, the Holtzman and Broken Mammoth specimens. So here we have the osseous tools from Broken Mammoth, and I thank Chuck Holmes for taking this picture, because I don't know that we'll ever get these things back together in one place. Maybe they are now, but this is definitely an important record of what was found at Broken Mammoth in terms of the osseous technology. From Cultural Zone 4, dates 13,750 to 13,100 years ago range. There are brief reports and some descriptions, the most lengthy description by Hepner in her master's thesis from 2017. Chuck Holmes described them in the Fred West book, and there's a very brief description of these tools from Yesner in 1994. Bone rods with one beveled end and an antler point from there, and this bibeveled sort of handle, OA4, is there. Probably the most similar to what we're talking about at Holtzman is OA5, and it's most reminiscent of the Clovis, as well as those that we see from Holtzman, except it's a bit longer than the Holtzman specimens. So turning over to the Holtzman site here in Alaska, we have 8 stratified components like most of Shaw Creek, with some component down in the sand fairly deep, the 14,000 year level, and component 5B. The rods themselves are from component 5A, and so I'll talk a little bit more about that. But just to mention, this is a well stratified site. You got activity areas with hearth features and areas working around a hearth. And if you note component 2 there in the top middle, a single flint knapping event which produced fully half of the lithics at the whole site, but you can see where the flint knapper sat essentially and switched from his left knee to his right, or his or her left knee or right knee, as they reduced this, I think it's basalt or fine-grained basalt of some sort, lithic from the middle Holocene, middle to early Holocene component 2. But the densest cultural component at the site really is component 5A, where you have some smaller hearths than the Younger Dryas period, but is surrounded primarily by mammoth ivory working and some cooking of bird, a few larger animals around these hearths where they're clearly working mammoth ivory with quartz ventifacts and shaping these. There's fragments of tusks, and just a lot of ivory debitage located in component 5A. So I can talk a little bit about the different dates here, but essentially component 5A is between 13,800 and 12,800 years old. In terms of the stratigraphy, that's all there, concurrent radiocarbon ages, clear presence of human activity in each of these layers, and the chronology and stratigraphy are all sealed within their stratigraphic units. And I'll also note that there's 11 to upwards of 20 centimeters in some places of the site that separate component 5A from the oldest component 5B at the site. And we'll take another look here at those 2 components momentarily. This is the radiocarbon ages from component 5A and component 5B. Specifically, we have about 24 dates from the site in particular, but we're dating bone collagen when we can. But in these component 5 levels, there's not a lot of charcoal to be had. Luckily, we found some charcoal stuck to a flake. Luckily, in component 5B, that gave us one of the oldest dates at the site. And I'm actually not even seeing that date on this list, but it is there. Oh, there it is. It's the second one from the bottom, Poplar salix groups on charcoal, dating about 14,000 years ago. The precise age of the mammoth tusk that was recovered from that level. So this is an image of component 5A from the 2019 excavation, and you can see a large anvil, flat anvil stone there, kind of called it home base during the excavation because it's almost the size of a baseball plate. And hearth activity, and you can see one of these hearths there, not a ton of charcoal, but there's burned bone, and there burned bird bone and a few pieces of larger bone. There were some twigs in there as well, but just not a lot of wood to be burned during this period. And surrounding these activity areas are a lot of ivory debitage in this time period. So I realize I'm almost out of time here. Here's a map of the two components. The star indicates where the rods were found. And these are the mammoth ivory rods. Specimen 1 is 5 conjoining fragments. It's got a rounded base and this beveled tip. It's got the rectangular corners, and this is one that was split longitudinally there down the middle. It's not in the best of shape, but we did send one fragment that had flaked off for radiocarbon dating, and it dates about 13,580 to 13,500. Specimen 2 there on the right is smaller and kind of stubbier. 2 conjoining fragments is much better preserved. It's got that oval shape and the beveled end with striations. Its mass is a little bit heavier, so it's just better preserved, and slightly beveled lower end that's kind of damaged on that. So they're not the most impressive artifacts to look at because there is some weathering, groundwater that kind of goes through some parts of Holtzman that can cause some of this deterioration. But nonetheless, these are the ivory rods from Holtzman. We know they used ivory and collected ivory. This is the tusk from component 5B. So they were engaged in this from the beginning of the first people to show up at Shaw Creek. And the radiocarbon dates there show overlapping ivory with human activities. And I know I'm out of time, so I'll just say, yeah, we found some ivory rods at Holtzman at Shaw Creek, and it links convincingly to an interior route for the peopling of the Americas. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Brian. The next presenter is Gerad Smith, and he sent me a presentation to share. There we go. And this should work.
Thank you for coming to the discussion on my interpretation of the pickup stick site, which I believe is the remains of Potlatch House. So the site was first documented in 2010 by Chuck Holmes, Dr. Holmes, and Randy Tidor, who hiked out there just after a wildfire had burned all the vegetation on the site. There was limited excavations that followed in 2011, 2014, 15, and 17, and then we took a field school with the UAF Anthropology Department out in 2019 and did a full-scale excavation of the feature. So the interesting pit feature was observed here. Randy is measuring it under all of these trees, hence the name Pickup Sticks. It was located right at the top of this summit of this hill here. So here's what the surface feature looks like after we strip the vegetation away in 2019, rather large. These are the remains of a trench excavation that was expanded out by Chuck in previous years here. And our DEM up here, you can see a distinct surface berm extending around this. So as we began to excavate into this surface depression, we noticed quite a large number of partially decayed, partially scorched timber features. We were able to identify most of these as either, all of these as either birch or spruce. So of the remains we were able to recover, it was about 85% identified as birch and 15% identified as spruce. So there's either a preference by the people at the time for using birch, or that was just what was available on the hillside at the time. So it was very interesting to us that some of these pieces that were right near what would have been the base of the wall were still in their sort of horizontal and vertical positions that recalled what Craig Mishler described as the traditional houses of at the Good Pasture and Big Delta villages, which here he published in 1986 from his interlocutor Abraham Luke. So here these villages were actually rather close. Here's Good Pasture Village on the Tanana. Big Delta would have been right here, and straight north across Quartz Lake, almost 10 miles, is the Pickup Stick site and Swan Point. So all of these sites were in close proximity to each other. So the spatial organization of these timber fragments suggested to me that most of them were likely part of a single wall, the south-facing wall of this structure, after having observed quite a number of cabins falling into various states of decay around the Tanana Valley and the Yukon-Tanana uplands, I suspect the southeastern corner of the wall had collapsed inward first, causing this twisted formation that appears in the wall fragments today, and perhaps the southwestern corner of the wall had stayed upright for a longer period of time. The eastern and western facing walls, there's almost no remains of either of those structures left, so they probably stayed upright as they either rotted or burned away. When we got through the feature all the way down to the floor, or the bedrock, the regolith, we found that the interior of the house, so this red dotted line is roughly where the exterior walls would have been. It was very difficult to parse those out exactly, but the interior of the house had been dug out to a depth of about 4 or 5 inches. And here you can see this represents the corner of the south or the northwestern side of the house right here. So it had been dug in prehistorically as part of the original house construction. We found birch bark fragments indicating that birch bark strips had been laid across the floor, kind of similar to linoleum today. And there was the remains of a single peg right here in the wall that had probably been used to hold that birch bark in place. So this is our eastern stratigraphic profile going through the very center of the house here, and one of the micromorphology samples. So this micromorphology sample shows the regolith, the very soft regolith down here at the bottom, represented by this white crumbly rock, and we had some birch bark fragments of the floor stripping right here, and then the fill on top of it is just full of microplaty fractures, suggesting this is all a lot of unmixed, unconsolidated fill that has just gradually collapsed in on the house as part of the later taphonomic processes. But we do have over on the north side of the house, and mostly kind of outside of the house pit, these other two heavy organic heavy layers. So what might those be? Most of this is still in an unexcavated portion of the site, but I suspect that this is probably the north-facing wall of the house had perhaps collapsed out and pulled some of the roof, or maybe perhaps all of the roof with it, and it had accordioned off on the north side of the house there, and so we have a wall and a roof feature sort of collapsing in on top of themselves there. Best guess at this point. So we're able to recover radiocarbon from the bark fragments at the base of the house, as well as a twig fragment from sort of midway up the profile. Both of those overlapped at 930 calibrated dates or calibrated years BP, and we believe those are representative of the actual human occupation at the house. There was another date we got on birch bark that was from the upper layers that dated to about 600 calibrated years BP. We believe that that was probably the remains of a tree that had grown up afterwards and had died. And then there was also this unique radiocarbon signal from a moose bone fragment that was found sort of on in the interior, but off on the side of the house. And this represented a date of about 1,500 years. That was very interesting. But we do have one of these later northern archaic points, so that could perhaps indicate that there was an earlier occupation at the site, or perhaps that bone represented an item that had been curated by the people and from an earlier time. So all the lithic artifacts, we found quite a variety of bifaces, scrapers, burin spalls, blades, and retouched flakes. So at the very basic, this indicated that there was activities of retooling, butchery, skinning, and woodworking occurring here at the site. So this residence indicated or matches exactly what Craig Mishler described at Good Pasture as a dual family residence, where you would bring two families in from opposite clans, from opposite moieties that would then enter into a lifelong partnership of economic assistance for each other. And so they would each live on opposite sides of the house. And then the back of the house could be reserved for their elder parents that may or may not decide to live with them. If so, sometimes this is referred to as a four-family house when they're also living within it. But houses like this also were built for potlatches. So these dual family partnership houses could be built with the intent of lifetime use by the village's head person, or it might be created only for the singular occasion of the potlatch. Families might move into one after a potlatch was completed, or the residence might be abandoned right after the ceremony had concluded. One large structure was built at Ketchumstuck in 1919 for the singular occasion and abandoned soon after. The 1926 potlatch at Healy Lake and abandoned after. So with lithic debitage disc patterns, we find that the majority of lithic debitage was discarded near the front of the house. This is the traditional women's work area within the house, and also it's clustering more towards the the southwestern corner of the house, with a few lithic discards sort of around the periphery. We were able to get a number of obsidian pieces that we were able to get geochemically sourced. All the obsidian is coming from, again, the west side of the house, which we believe represents the front of the house, so the women's work area. And there's two distinct patterns. On the southwestern side of the house here, we have obsidian coming from Wiki Peak almost entirely. On the north side of the house here, we have obsidian coming either from both Botsatana and Mount Itziza. It's very interesting that they're separated this way. And again, lends credence that there was two unrelated families that were present in the house, and both of those families represent different trade networks, access to different trade networks. The faunal discard patterns, there wasn't a lot that we could actually positively identify, but most of these were ungulates and a lot of large bones that could only be probably from a moose. Again, a lot of discards towards the front of the house, but the vast majority of these pieces were actually found outside of the house feature. And then we had a minority of bird remains that were scattered throughout the house as well. And then perhaps some red squirrel and one bone that was very similar to an otter's femur. And that was very unique because otters are considered to be a very stingy, taboo animal that only the most powerful of shamans could actually safely handle. So was this a structure that was built or that was used long-term or for only a short period? There was very, very little floor wear that we observed in this excavated area within the regolith. The small walls there were very sharp. They were well maintained, and after only being on the site for 2 weeks, it was we were having to pack up a lot of earth against that to keep the wear and tear down on this, just from people getting in and out of the excavation. There was very little evidence of an indoor hearth. Perhaps one had been used maybe for a little light, but not extensively if one was actually present. There's no evidence of any floor sweeping or cleaning of the artifacts. Again, those obsidian and other lithic discards were just kind of left in place as if they were just representing kind of a singular event. So what is additional evidence that this might have been a ceremonial potlatch house? There's the definite spatial constriction of artifacts and lithic types. There is this overly elaborate construction type that's usually indicates long-term family use, but in this is probably part, in this case, we're interpreting it as being probably part of a ceremony. It had this very pristine, unworn floor. That rock would have definitely been worn away into just kind of probably a pit-like feature if this had even been extensively used over a single season. No evidence of an interior hearth. And there was the possible evidence of these powerful NG otter bones that were being used inside there. The work indicated that lithic reduction was being only occurring near the front of the house in the traditional women's area, and it was also dominated by just a single corner of the house. And this really suggests that there was a heavy production area of representing work on one side of the house, and there was consumption throughout the entire house. So this is additional evidence that excuse me, one family was actually gifting a ceremony to the other family that was visiting them. So our conclusion then is that this feature does represent a singular occupation 800 to 900 calibrated years ago, and that at least two families were represented in this house. Both families represent quite different access to different raw materials, as evidenced by the obsidian. So they're representing different trade networks. They're coming together in a single house. One family is producing the vast majority of the discards, and the rest of the members in the family, again, are consuming that. And labor, so like I said, labor is dominated by one side. And we can probably hazard a guess that this represents an early autumn occupation. Quite a lot of time and effort went into creating this structure that was there. A lot of excavation had to occur, therefore, indicating that this was probably a warm season construction event. And then the structure was abandoned soon after. I don't believe it was burned as part of the consumption ceremony. It was just probably abandoned, and there was a variety of taphonomic processes of the structure collapsing due to rot, and then possibly burning in a later just natural wildfire. So far, we have published the results of these as part of my PhD dissertation in 2020, and this book has just come out this year, The Gift of the Middle Tanana. But some of these analyses representing the obsidian and the wood identification still has not yet been published, so we'll be preparing another peer review article for peer review. Thank you very much, and if you have further questions about this, please do not hesitate to contact me through email. Thank you.
All right, that was Gerad. And then just in time for our next presentation, which is Josh Reuther. And yeah, maybe Josh, maybe you can wait for 1 minute or something before you start.
Okay.
I would say we have time for one question, but there's nobody that may answer the question. It says it's 1:40 on my clock, Josh.
Okay. Can you hear me, François? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me, François and Gerad, and thank you for everyone being here. I'd like to present a few of our results on Obsidian work. I'm coming to you live from Fairbanks in the Tanana Valley. And we've been lucky enough to conduct a lot of Obsidian research over the years in Alaska. And some of this I'd like to summarize for you for the Middle Tanana today. Okay. And I wanted to go over sort of the boundaries of our study area today in the Middle Tanana. It's Healy Lake to the west and the Upward Sun to the north and east, and Delta River Overlook to the south. It's in the traditional lands of the Middle and Upper Tanana Dene. We've been lucky enough to conduct myself 20 years worth of research in the region, and my colleagues, some of my colleagues even longer. And I sort of want to give you a background of Obsidian research that has led up to this point. Research has gone on since the late 1960s, and starting with neutron activation, James Griffin doing work on onion portage out of the University of Michigan, and the studies of Don Clark, Annette McFadden Clark, and William Patton around Botsatana. And then John Cook at the same time in the 1960s doing work along the Taylor Highway and then the Healy Lake Village Obsidian, that he started working with neutron activation and actually trying to source. And Newt Fladmark and Earl Nelson in the 1970s and 80s surveying around Mount Edziza and doing geochemical analyses on XRF. And these are really led to some research of John's in the 1990s and working at other Obsidian sources like Botsatana, Wiki Peak, and other geologic locales and archaeology sites, and gathering a large scale sampling throughout Alaska. And that really led to the first sort of summarization of Obsidian groups and locales in Alaska on a large scale. Around 2005, John approached a few of us with working with his data, and myself, Jeff Speakman, Jeff Rasic, and others. And we started to form ad hoc groups to pursue this research, and portable technology on XRF started to really take off, and our analyses were really renewed at a faster pace. And we began working on something that we termed the Alaska Obsidian Database. And the background here is actually a photo from John and Dan Mann's work and Mike Kunz's work and at Botsatana as a source locale. These are just source locations for that show up in the Middle Tanana and some distances. You can see Edziza is over 1,000 kilometers away, and it shows up at different time periods in Hoodoo Mountain in the southern Yukon, and then also Wiki Peak in eastern Alaska. And a lot of these groups, I'd like to point out, is that we don't really know their geological source location. Some are in mainland Alaska. We return mainland Alaska, some in southern Yukon, and others are fully unknown where their locations. And sometimes we have a very small sample size, 1 or 2 pieces, so it's hard to track down that actual location. For those of you who have not seen photos or have not been out to Botsatena, this is in northern Alaska, and these are this is the source locale, a picture of one of the source flows. There's actually about 8 of them that John and Mike Kunz have actually visited. And here's some of the packages that you actually find in those areas. And these are actual source samples that are archived in the museum that we use to use sort of geochemical studies to create baselines for the Botsatena source. Jeff Rasic has recently ran a ton of these, so we're getting the geochemical variation of Botsatena source, and also WikiPeak. Jeff sent me some of these photos of WikiPeak source area, and here's sort of the package sizes of those areas. And so we continue to conduct not only source sampling, but also sampling at study sites. And here's, for this study, we have an unusual sort of set of archaeological materials where we have dated components throughout single sites. We have single dated components, and then some that we don't have any dates, but we can actually start playing with time and movements of materials throughout the region. And this is a table of just what Monty Rogers would call maybe an incredibly complex table with little font that no one can read. I'll show you another one, but just to show that these are dominated by, our sample size is dominated by 3 major sites. And that's because a lot of major excavation happened at these sites. So we need to recognize that a few locales actually might skew our patterns. And once we start bumping up our sample size with other sites and more representative samples, that our patterns can change. But right now, this is what we have. And I just want to point out the analytical techniques that we've been using: neutron activation at MUR, the Smithsonian with laser ablation, ICP-MS, and XRF at the National Park Service, Northern Land Use, Smithsonian, and the museum. And right now we've got about over 2,700 data points right now, and that's QC data. And when I mean QC data is I started with actually over 4,000. And so there's pieces that I need to go back, for example, with Healy Lake, and actually work with John's data to rerun them. And so by the time we get done, we may have over 4,000 actual data points for this analysis in the long run. And I wanted to point out that every time we run something, we actually run a standard. And if that standard actually falls outside of 2 sigma values, that we actually reject the run of what we're doing for the archaeological Obsidian. So that's how we can actually control how the machines are working and actually valid data coming out. Just a little bit of general results. As I showed you in the map, that we're actually between almost equidistance between Botsatena and WikiPeak, which actually allows us to kind of look at different material flows from these major groups at different times. And we also have these unique groups from, or sources from the Yukon, and also unique groups from mainland Alaska that are sort of in the area in lesser quantities. But for the most part, there's for our overall sample, that we have equal representation of both Botsatena from the north and eastern Alaskan sources, such as WikiPeak and Group A Prime, which doesn't have a common name. It's sometimes referred to as the Ringling source. Now, when we start playing with time, we can look at these in general periods and look at the late Pleistocene. We have a dominance of WikiPeak in certain areas. And we also have these unique groups like Group H at Swan Point and Healy Lake. during the early Holocene, we actually get more representation of Botsatana, and then we get equal representation in the Middle Holocene, but we see a lot more diversity in these other groups from mainland Alaska and the Yukon throughout the Middle Holocene and the Late Holocene. And if we want to look at squiggly graphs, we can look at this in sort of blocks of time at 1,000 years. And we see Wiki Peak again is very much represented in this early group until 10,000. And then we start to see Botsatana, which is this, the orange line or Northern Alaskan groups, more represented in the region, but we actually have an ebb and flow certain times of Yukon materials. And then we get, for about 1,000-year block around 4,000 years ago, we get a switch to Wiki Peak, and then later on we actually have a lot of diversity coming into the system from other sources. And we can start to look at connections between sites if we actually block these out in finer grained 1,000-year blocks. And you can see some of the representation of Wiki Peak and Botsatana in blue. And then this is actually Group H, which is the unknown locale, but we can generally put lines on here. And this is just a general schematic of the flow of these materials through sites. And I would like to know that because we block this out generally in just arbitrary 1,000-year blocks, radiocarbon doesn't really work that way. And you could have representation or some connection between Swan Point Group H and the Healy Lake Group H, also connections between sites. Just because we blocked them out this way, it's sort of just arbitrary. We can also look at representation through other source groups like Hoodoo Mountain. We've got a connection between Swan Point and Upward Sun coming in, and then also just Wiki Peak actually being used throughout here in the until 10,000 years ago. And then we start to see at 10,000 years ago through 6,000 years ago, which is a larger block of time, but we see a lot more diversity in the record. And as Gerad pointed out in his presentation, that we have potentially a lot more trade networks really developing and people interacting and moving a lot of materials in. Certainly by 1,000 years ago, we actually have copper coming into Swan Point and the Klein site. And so we have an opportunity to look at these interactions and how they developed over time, and also tie them into sort of these narratives that Gerad's been working on with Jim Carrey and Evie on travel narratives, things like that. And at 1,000 years ago, we really start to see a lot of groups showing up at these sites. And there's, as Gerad pointed out, at Pickup Sticks, we may have his interpretation of a potlatch and many groups getting together in certain areas. We can start to play with technology and artifact types, but the main thing about this is that Botsatana and Wiki Peak are being used sort of in the same way with microblade technology and blade technology and bifacial technology. With our data set, it's sort of hard to work with not every researcher defined everything systematically. So we sort of have general categories here. If it was actually done systematically, we may be able to look at this in a little finer grain way. Okay, so just some general observations. Before 12,000 Cal BP, Wiki Peak is the most commonly used source in the region. But after about 11,000 and 10,000, we see more increases of Botsatana at a similar frequency. Sites can be connected through understanding the obsidian flows through time. And both sources seem to be similarly used in technological organizational systems. During the Middle Holocene, we start to get a lot more groups, diversity in, and this may be where we start seeing a lot more interactions through trade networks. And we can one of the ways that we can start looking at this in the near future is to actually add some more sites from the Upper Tanana, Toke Terrace, and Dead Man Lake being one that we've worked with Bob Sattler and Angelo Uni on. I'd like to make some acknowledgments. I was going to spend a little bit more time on this, but I wanted to actually make another acknowledgement at the end of this talk. And I wanted to express my support for some of my good friends and colleagues, Svieta Yaman Pasternak, who talked the other day, and my colleague, Igor Pasternak, along with many other Ukrainian families here, and also Ukrainian friends and researchers that we have overseas. And Svieta talked so eloquently the other day about the current devastation in the Ukraine, and also the need for the Arctic Council to speak against the actions there. And I want to encourage those who have ties to the Arctic Council, of which Russia is currently the chair, to urge them to make a statement in condemning the aggression and destruction in the Ukraine over the past week. And you can see today they have not made that statement. And they haven't made a statement of the detainment of Russian people who have spoken out against this destruction. And I want to urge those who have ties to congressional members to also urge them to urge the Arctic Council to make a statement too. Thank you, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Josh. So next is the break time, 20 minutes break time. But before that, in the beginning of this break session, I think Josh, Briana, and I are happy to answer any questions that attendants may have. And I don't know if people can unmute themselves, but if not, you can type your question in the chat.
François, I don't know. I guess Jared's not around, but Elizabeth Cook had a question about the discovery of the pickup sticks or the house site, I guess.
I did see that. So Gerad is not here,
Okay.
but if Chuck wants to answer that question,
Right.
I think Chuck can very well answer it as well. Chuck? He may have left.
So Chuck actually went out there and was working out there with a group of students at the time, and they actually saw the depression and started to test it. I think it was actually around when I was actually doing my dissertation, so it was a pretty while ago. And Randy was there, I think, the first time with him. Randy was working with him. And the depression. Yeah. Oh, there you go.
Yes, I think Gerad focused on that at the very beginning of his presentation. And I was doing survey with Randy, and we went out there after that big forest fire in 2010. And as we were looking around, we could see this large pit underneath all the trees that had fallen down, hence the name Pickup Sticks, which was nicely illustrated in his talk. So that's how we discovered the site. And we did do a test outside of the site and noted there were artifacts at some depth of about 60 centimeters, but that was outside of the pit itself. So we knew there was something earlier than the pit probably, and then the pit looked a little more recent, and then subsequent testing proved that to be the case.
Any other question? Oh, Jennifer?
Oh, yeah. Hi.
Hi.
I can do my. Thanks so much. The presentations were really interesting. I had a question for Josh about the changes in the obsidian sources through time. Do you have any ideas about why there were such drastic changes in some of those time periods?
Yeah, I mean, were sort of ideas that we're actually as a group sort of talking about more. There's a develop. My thinking is that there's actually a development of increased trading networks and increased areas that people are actually interacting in the Holocene, and we see that in other areas. I think we've written about that in a chapter that I did. Oh God, it's been almost 10 years ago or something. So I still hold those ideas, and that's what I think why we're seeing this. To me, it's interesting that we're starting to get Yukon stuff very early on, and then it sort of falls out into the. We get it about 10,000 years ago, 11,000 years ago, and then it sort of falls out and comes back again about 6,000 years ago. But I think that those are things that we're sort of kicking around as a group, those ideas of those changes. And this is stuff I've just sort of gotten together for this talk pretty recently. So
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, thanks. It's interesting story.
Yep. And if anybody has any ideas, please throw them out to me. Send me an email.
I have a question for Brian. Do you have any sort of evidence that you have the manufacturing process for these roads taking place at the site of Holzman, or is it just the end products that have been created for some time and brought there?
I mean, from what we have, I think they were using the rods there. They are clearly making ivory, but we don't have those are the only two ivory tools that we have, and we don't have anything like sort of in manufacturing stage. We just have a ton of debitage, like bags and bags of fractured ivory and fragments. And the quartz, in some cases, like a quartz scraper, Vintifact that is like sitting on the fragment of the tusk, like they had just kind of walked away from it. But it's strewn all over that component around the hearths. It's kind of like a big mess, really. and aside from those rods, those are the only ivory or osseous tools that we've seen so far. So maybe they're carrying it off. It almost, one of the fragments almost looks like they're just roughing out blanks of ivory and maybe taking that off site somewhere else.
Cool. If nobody has any further question, maybe we can, the presenters can break out, and then we will reconvene at 12:20 for you, Hirasawa's presentation.
Cave too, and upward some river sites. Both individuals belong to the American Palearctic tradition or Denali complex in cultural chronology. According to several genetic studies, ancient Beringian was the genetically isolated population in Beringia at least from 24,000 to 9,500 KBP. If the ancient Beringian was the only genetic group that migrated into Alaska in the late Pleistocene, the population of East Beringian tradition was the ancient Beringian. So interestingly, the date range overlaps the emergence of microblade technology and its technological divergence. Traditionally, the original location of microblade appearance has been thought of as southern Siberia. However, according to recent studies, microblades with pressure flaking technique appeared between 30,000 and 25,000 cal-BP in Far East Asia, such as Yakutia, Hokkaido Island, Korean Peninsula, or northeastern China. Because microblades became one of the main hunting tools in Beringia during the late Upper Paleolithic, its emerged dates and expansion routes have been intensively discussed. Another interesting problem is the origin and diffusion of the Yubetsu method. This is the topic we focus on today. So these bifacial microcores featured with long ridge and ski spole have been found from both sides of Beringia. Ductile complex in Yakutia has been regarded as the origin of this technology. However, there was some criticism of this hypothesis too. Same as the LGM microblades, some more reliable dates of Yubetsu method assemblages have been reported from different regions in Siberia and Far East Asia. As a result, some hypotheses suggest that origin in Hokkaido, northeastern China, or multiple locations. Why we focus on the Yubetsu method is because it's found from Swan Point Culture Zone 4B or East Beringian tradition in interior Alaska. Currently, Swan Point site is the oldest site in northern North America and the most eastern Yubetsu assemblage in Beringia. However, at the same time, it is the only known site with Yubetsu technology in North America. Therefore, studying the assemblage has significant meaning when we consider the initial human migration into Alaska. Although it is not discussed in this paper, the significance is also applicable for the issues of local technological continuity. Interpretation of technological change invited arguments on replacement or continuity of culture and population from East Beringian tradition to Denali complex. Recent studies support technological continuity from the late Pleistocene to the early Holocene. However, there might be a much more complex history of cultural diffusion and changes that occurred in the prehistory. So based on the backgrounds I explained, we set two main objectives. The first is to evaluate and define the characteristics of the Swan Point CZ4B microcore and Buran technology in Beringia. Because we do not have a comparable assemblage in Eastern Beringia, we need to compare it with Western Beringian industries. The second objective is to seek the origin of the strict Yubetsu method. To accomplish these objectives, we need to define the CZ4B microcore and the Buran technologies first. Then we look up the published reports of Yubetsu-related assemblages in Siberia and Far East Asia and examine their radiocarbon dates for inter-regional comparison. So first, I would like to clarify the term Yubetsu we use. This term has been used by many archaeologists working in Beringian archaeology, but because of its large regional and chronological coverage, the term applied for variations in different regions. According to Sato and Tsutsumi 2007, microblade core type technotypology can be classified into the criteria by the criteria shown on the slide. They also differentiate the strict Yubetsu from other Yubetsu method types. The strict Yubetsu use bifacial, leaf, or oval-shaped blanks. The platform is formed with long axis ridge and ski spole detachment. The platform rejuvenation is also done by ski spole flaking. Other types are classified based on the different criteria in steps. The first important criteria are unifacial flake and blade blank or bifacial blank. This distinguishes Togeshita and other Yubetsu types. The second criteria are length and direction of spole detachment. If the spole only removes the part of the platform, it is an Osholoko type. The third is an orientation of spole removal against the core axis. If the spole is flaked along the short axis, it is classified as a Lankush type. The fourth is creating the keel or knot for the first spole removal. If there is no keel on the blank, the core forms a bolt-like shape. So although this classification system is based on the Hokkaido Island cases, some of these types, including the strict Yubetsu, distribute in Siberia and other Far East Asian regions. So from here, I would like to describe the known technological features of the Yubets assemblage at the Swan Point CZ4B. I have heard the session organizers introduce important sites in the Middle Tanana Valley. I just indicate the location of the Swan Point site here. So since the early publication about the Swan Point by Chuck Holmes, the microcores have been described as the different types from Denali complex campus type microcores. Gómez, Coutouly, and Holmes 2018 provided the most detailed study and report about the microcores, and they are only produced by the Yubetsu pressure flaking method. In total, 10 microcores and 1 bifacial blank are found. Their platforms are created with large ridge and ski spole flaking along the long axis of the blank. Platform rejuvenations are also done only by ski spole detachment. Unique features are the cortical butts on the core distal end, and the dominant use of grayish-green igneous GGI raw material. The remnant of the cortical surface seems intentional because we can observe it on the bifacial blank too. The lithological identification of GGI has been conducted, but we still don't know its specific geological classification yet. With these technotypological features, we consider the Swan Point CZ4B cores are created by the strict Yubetsu method. The CZ4B assemblage also have over 30 burins. As the zooarchaeological study by Lanoë and Holmes and Ivory's tool study by Wygal et al. Indicate, these burins are very important tool when we consider the production of mammoth ivory materials. Hirasawa and Holmes reported the result of technotypological observation on those burins. The CZ4B burins can be classified into 5 production stages. The most notable feature of the burin is that they have 2 different blank forms, unifacial and bifacial. Especially bifacial burins are not common in Beringia except the reuse of the broken bifacial tools. The raw material difference seems related to blank forms. Bifacial burins use more calcedony, and unifacial burins use more GGI. Many repeated burin spoles indicate the frequent facet and platform rejuvenations and their rotations. Another important result is that we could not find any explicit example of Alaria type burins. So from here, I would like to compare the Swan Point Yubetsu method with other Western Beringian examples. This kind of comprehensive work has been done by many scholars in the past. One of the most recent comparative work of the Yubetsu method is done by Zhang, 2021. He uses Ikawa Fumiko's microcore technotypology diagram and updates the regional situations. As you see, there are various levels of technotypological classification applied in different regions for the Yubetsu method. There is no doubt on variations within the Yubetsu method. However, the Swan Point CZ4B microcores are all strict Yubetsu made. Therefore, we only use the assemblages with the strict Yubetsu and reliable radiocarbon dates for our comparative analysis. So I would like to start from the Siberian sites. As you know, Siberia is the mecca of microblade technology. Not only Russian and American archaeologists, but also some Japanese archaeologists researched it. Especially Hideaki Kimura's work is very useful because he tried to apply technological analysis for all major Siberian microblade sites and reported them with high-resolution illustrations. So he used the criteria I show on the slide and classified them into 3 major techniques. For our study, we use his report and picked up the sites with techniques A and A-, which are equal to the strict Yubetsu. So here's the result of the screening. The left table shows the site lists with the strict Yubetsu microcore method. According to Kimura, the method can be only seen east of the Angara River basin. The radiocarbon dates are cited from the date lists reported by different pieces of literature. At first, there are not many sites that have both explicit microcore specimen and trustable radiocarbon dates. However, although there are very minor variations, the strict Yubetsu method spreads from Lake Baikal to Far East Russia, including Sakhalin and Kamchatka. The Duktai Cave and Kurla sites have relatively old dates, around 17,000 Cal BP, but others usually fall in the range from 16,000 to 14,000. Although I expect not all Buran reported with illustration, I also want to mention the existence of angle and transverse unifacial Buran with the strict Yubetsu microcores. The second region I looked through is North and Northeastern China. Many Chinese scholars published the revision of microblade-related sites and hypotheses. Yue et al. And Feng et al. Are kinds of them. Their primary focus is defining the spatio-temporal chronology of the early microblade industry that happened before the LGM, and northern microblade industry appeared during the LGM. There are more reported radiocarbon dates and OSL dates of the early industry. According to works of literature about northern microblade industry, the strict Yubetsu in the region fits in the range from 17 to 14,000 Cal BP. However, I could not confirm the robust evidence of the dates which exactly indicate the timing of the appearance of the strict Yubetsu. We need more AMS dates for multiple Yubetsu assemblages. So there are not many studies focusing on the transverse Burans in North and Northeastern China. One good study is done by Shinji Kato. He looked through the upper Paleolithic assemblages in China and conducted technotypological analysis on 100 Burans from 24 sites. He reported the transverse Burans associated with the various lithic industries. Longwanchan site layer 4 is a non-Yubetsu microblade assemblage with multiple AMS dates on charcoal. The assemblage is situated around 26,000 and 24,700 Cal BP. Kato also indicates the transverse Burans are found from post-LGM Yubetsu assemblage, such as Shijitan Esdale and Shuegan. The last region for the comparison is Hokkaido Island, or the former PSHK Peninsula. Hokkaido is known to have the most divided microcore typology in Northeastern Asia. In the typology, Shirataki type and Sakotsu type are included in the strict Yubetsu. Local scholars consider that these industries are chronologically close and partially overlaps. However, there are not so many sites with well-associated radiocarbon dates. The sites on the map are almost all of them, and I also show other Yubetsu method LGM sites too. I show some examples of Sakotsu and Togeshita 2 assemblage cores on the slide. Sakotsu type is one of the strict Yubetsu techniques, which was originally defined by Masakazu Yoshizaki. Togeshita 2 is a flake or blade blank base type. Because these two types microcores were found from the same cultural components at the Akatsuki site, these types are treated as a single industry. The slide also shows the radiocarbon dates of Pirika Togeshita 1 industry. Pirika is also known as a bifacial wedge-shaped microcore type, but it is distributed during the LGM. There was a large tephra distribution around 19,000 Cal BP in central to South Hokkaido. It is also used for the separation of these different Yubetsu methods. The radiocarbon dates from 5 sites with Sakotsu Togeshita 2 industry show a date range from 18,400 to 16,200 Cal BP. Transverse Burans are also frequently associated with the microblade assemblages in PSHK, especially in the Hokkaido Island. The Burans on flake or braid blank with marginal retouch, right to left Buran facet on its distal end, are called Araya type in northern Japan. Some Japanese archaeologists suggested the Araya distribute outside of Japan. As same as in China, the transverse burins are associated with LGM and post-LGM microblade industries. However, burin technotypological studies are Western microcores. So to understand the Swan.CZ4B burins, we need more studies on burin technology in terms of its definitions, useful analysis, technological variations, and their spatio-temporal distributions. So I would like to summarize the results of the comparison. I also added Korean Peninsula as other regions which have the strict Yubetsu microcore. In Siberia, the strict Yubetsu was confirmed in different subregions. Although the Duktai cave is known as a type site of the Duktai complex, there is a contemporaneous site, Kura, on the north coast of Lake Baikal and Upper Lena region. In north and northeastern China, the northern microblade industry contains the Yubetsu, a strict Yubetsu. However, even in the recent studies, there are not enough radiocarbon dates to specify the narrow range of the assemblage. In addition, some of the studies treated Yubetsu as a very general term to indicate the bifacial blank microcores. The same issue is happening in Korean Peninsula due to the lack of well-associated dates with the Siange type 1 or Howard-Gary complex, which represented strict Yubetsu assemblages. So in PSHK, primarily on Hokkaido Island, there are good dates associated with the lithic concentrations, and the dates are relatively older than in other regions. So I would like to conclude our presentation. In this presentation, we clearly defined the Swan.CZ4B Yubetsu method as the strict Yubetsu. This must be distinguished from other Yubetsu or bifacial blank spore rejuvenating microcores. So through review and reported strict Yubetsu assemblages and their reliable date range, we tentatively suggest that the oldest evidence is in PSHK region. Other region shows a close time range each other. Therefore, at least with current data, the strict Yubetsu possibly diffused from PSHK and spread toward Yakutia, Baikal, northeastern China, and Korean Peninsula. Origin of the Swan.0 strict Yubetsu can be from Duktai complex as expected by the past studies. We need further studies on technological variation within the strict Yubetsu method among different regions. This expectation partially supports Graf and Buvit's hypothesis that they explained PSHK was the LGM refugia and post-LGM migration that occurred from the region. However, there is a contradiction with the genome studies on Hokkaido Jomon people because the Jomon population diverged earlier than the ancient Beringian did from the common ancestor population and no admixture between them. Population migration from PSHK to Alaska is no reasonable explanation. We need genome data of ancient Beringian from Western Beringia to solve this problem. Without this kind of the direct evidence, we also can expect technological diffusion from PSHK to Alaska through Yakutia. On the contrary to the microblade coarse technology, burin technology at Swan.0 is not the same as the Araya or transverse burins in Western Beringia. However, I predict that many burins have not been reported in Western Beringia. Therefore, we need more illustrations or photographs to confirm the existence of the similar technology. So these are works cited by bibliography and acknowledgement, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Yu. Our next talk is by Julie Esdale. Julie.
Hey there, let me just share my screen. Can you hear me, François?
Yes.
What do you guys see? My notes or my?
Yeah, we see your current slide and the next slide and your notes.
Oh, okay, here. Let's try this again. Sorry.
Yeah, you had it there, Julie.
Did I have it right? Oh, now I can't even find Zoom. Okay. Oh no. Sorry, I've just lost the share screen thing. I'm looking for it. Okay, okay, here we go. So, screen. Okay, that should be right now. Does that look good, Bob?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I'm not
Okay.
enabled to do it, so I'm glad you caught it. Good.
Okay, well, thanks, guys. Bob Sattler and I were sharing some site information, and we discovered we had some small bifacial tools that were sort of interesting that we thought dated to the late Holocene. And so we sort of wanted to share what we found at a couple sites with you guys and see if you have anything similar. So, of course, we're in the Tanana Valley and close to the Tanana Valley. You can see those 2 stars on the slide on the are the locations of the 2 sites we're going to talk about today.
Julie, sorry
Julie.
to interrupt. We can still see your notes. I don't know if it's an issue for you.
Oh, here, I'll just do the, what if I do this? Well, I don't know. I don't know how to fix it. Okay, well, I don't know how to fix it. So do you guys want to say?
But we can also see the current slide, so that
Okay.
works, as long as you don't
We good there?
Before they had
Is it bigger now? Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah, hooray. Job,
I
Julie.
can't see my notes anymore, but that's okay. I probably don't need them. So we've got the 2043 site, 2743 site. We don't have a name for it there in the Tanana Valley in the Wood River Buttes area. And then Bob Sattler is going to talk about the David site over here on the Yukon River. So 2743 is a site that we found in the Wood River Buttes Archaeological District. And the Buttes Archaeological District is in the southwestern part of the Tanana Flats area in what we call Tanana Flats Training Area of Fort Wainwright. And there's about a dozen sites located on the Buttes just overlooking the Wood River there. This site is the yellow dot there amongst all the purple. Most of the sites were found by Jim Dixon and others in 1979 when they were doing a survey out there. And we went back to do some site monitoring. We hadn't visited those sites in a lot of years. So in 2020, my team went back to do some monitoring and relocating those sites. And we were able to find this new site in between some of the others that Dixon had identified on the Buttes. This was a large lithic scatter. It was about 20 meters wide. We don't have all the flakes mapped there, but we collected lots of flakes. We collected all the obsidian flakes. Sorry, there are 18 of them, 5 scrapers, 3 small projectile points, and there were about 150 artifacts exposed on the surface total. So there were 19 pieces of obsidian, and we've been talking about this today, so I'll just let you know where they were from. One was located, or the source of the obsidian for one flake was the Wiki Peak source, and the other 18 were from the Botsatana source. So you can see where Fort Wainwright is, sort of in between, smack dab in between these 2 obsidian sources, and we generally get a pretty even distribution of source locations for obsidian from sites on Army training lands. And generally the sites in the Tanana Flats skew a little more Botsatana, and the ones in the Donnelly training area, which is in the south, the southeastern blob there, those skew sort of Wiki Peak or an even split. So it's pretty common for us to get obsidian from both sources, and sometimes hoodoo as well, Mountainside once in a while. As you can see, the vegetation is, well, there's lots of exposures up there, lots of wind blowouts, and you can see a lot of these artifacts right on the surface. We didn't excavate any holes to see how deep the stratigraphy was at the site of in 2020, but Jim Dixon's test pits from the 1970s show us that there's only about 15 centimeters of sediment on top of the bedrock of these hills, and so we could be looking at palimpsest deposits, although we do have a pretty nice little tight scatter there, so it also could be a single occupation. We just wouldn't know without further work there. pass it on to Bob now.
Okay, thanks, Julie, and thanks, François, for pulling this all together. Appreciate everyone listening in, and can say that I hope we can all meet in person next year since I got the stage here. It's been a long time. What I want to do is take over to the Yukon River, a very specific component that has implications for these small points, or I would say for what I've found there, an end blade, perhaps. And as many of you know, the Yukon River Upper Yukon River is connected to the Upper Tanana along with the ethnographic present called the Eagle Trail. Bill Simeon, the ethnographer, believes it's been there for a very long time. And then in my next slide, I'll come back to this. It also, at Calico Bluff, where the site's located, it's at the mouth of the 70-mile river. And if you go up the 70-mile river, you're over into the Middle Tanana drainage. And in the local stories in the Upper Tanana, Eagle, and even down in the Lower Tanana, there are stories and songs about the trading of dentalia shells through the Upper Yukon River into the Upper Tanana River. So to give you a little background here, this image here, the David site, you can see the little star in the center. So I'll be talking about the specific component. It has broad implications of what has largely been presented in some of the previous talks today, because that's one of the advantages of coming a little later in the day, incorporating data from earlier presentations. So you go down from the star in the middle, the triangular star is a Wiki Peak source that Josh was speaking about. The green triangle there is Mount Churchill. That's the source of the White River ash east and probably the north. I think we could say on the north. And then the red triangle is a Gulkana source, and Josh referred to that as Ringling, but in this presentation, I'll be referring to it as the Copper River source. And then for further reference, the green splotch there is a general footprint of the eastern lobe of the White River ash plume, and then the blue is the northern lobe, which I won't be talking about so much today. The little blue squares there are the excavation area and what we call the greenhouse locus there at the David site. And then to the right, you can see the sort of clear area. That's the corridor, Upper Yukon River corridor from the Canadian border down, was it maybe 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers. And just to the left of where it says the David site, you see another clear area, and that's the 70-mile river. On all the dots on the right side are sites within the riparian zone of the Upper Yukon River. And what I'll be hitting at is this northward movement of technology along the Yukon River, and the river in this area goes to the north. Next slide, Julie, sorry. Next one will be a view of Calico Bluff itself. This is one of the largest landforms in the Upper Yukon River. Most distinctive, very distinctive landform throughout the whole corridor from the Canadian border down to the Yukon Flats. This to the left there is a terrace, 7-meter high terrace that formed during the early Holocene. It's a very extensive archaeological site, and been excavating there for many years. And one of the distinctive features that I'll mention, since it was spoken about a little earlier, in the lower right corner at the face of Calico Bluff, there are 3 or 4 beds of argillite, dark argillite. That's the primary source of lithic material at the site. They have many components, a lot of obsidian that I won't be talking about today. But I invite all of you who work in the Middle Tanana that it is worth us getting our heads together and see if we can match some of this argillite here with what's being found in the Middle Yukon, or the Middle Tanana River, excuse me. And I mentioned already that the river, or the terrace there on the left, it's about 7 meters higher. It's an accretionary sequence of river silt. Underneath is glacial outwash. Next slide. So here's a view of our excavation area, Calico Bluff in the background. This was a native allotment. Gentleman bought it and put in place a archaeological conservation easement. Been working there for many years, working with field schools, universities, with NORM, and then some high school field schools. And this occupation I'll talk about here is a little further back than most of the Middle Holocene occupations, a distinct single assemblage. Okay, next one. There. Okay, so there's some graphics put together by Angela. We call it the greenhouse locus. It's a buried occupation down, 15 centimeters. So there's a series in the assemblage: firecracked rock, caribou bone, got extensive lithic assemblage of calico argillite, but also the two obsidian sources that I'll focus in on. Here on the right, you can see the blue triangles. Those are the lithic, the lithic feature that I'll be referring to. Firecracked rock, a lot of charcoal, and on the left side is the hearth feature. You got a very good excavation and description of that, very good description through the excavation. So extensive charcoal, firecracked rock, caribou bone, and this lithic assemblage, which I'll talk in the next slide. Julie, if you could advance. So the lithic assemblage, as you can see there on the upper right, argillite is a local material that comes out in large blocks, and I have a whole bucket of that I could send to all of you working in the Middle Tanana to make some connections. Basically, folks, we're taking blocks that are exfoliating off the bluff face, and there's as well, that's minor number of obsidian flakes. And of those obsidian sources, through Jeff's assistance, we got a series of Wiki Peak pieces, and then also the ringling copper. Okay, so it's a distinctive assemblage of that for the Upper Yukon River. Jeff had mentioned that the Copper River obsidian had not been found in the Yukon River corridor up to that point a couple of years ago. Okay, next slide, Julie. And also what happens, at this assemblage, we also find copper. So it's the only dated copper sequence or assemblage in the Upper Yukon River. And here's a preform, which worked a little bit in discussions with Chris Thomas there in the Yukon. And he's finding several of these in sites in the central southern Yukon within the plume of the eastern lobe of the White River ash. I collaborated almost identical pieces, 4 centimeters long, about a ½ centimeter in diameter. And then you can see there's a little fold in the top piece there. That's also distinctive of the pieces that are found in the southern Yukon. So next slide. This is where I'll wrap up. So this is buried assemblage. We've got dated charcoal from the very time of the White River ash, Copper River obsidian, Wiki Peak obsidian from further south. And if I want to ask all of you that are on here to maybe help me with this, here's a plot of the radiocarbon date we have. You can see in the upper right there, 846. Some of you may know the eastern lobe of the White River ash is dated through the Greenland ice core data as AD 846 and 848. And below that is the 92% probability. And if somebody can help me with this, is, if we know that the datum for radiocarbon dating is 1950, and we take 70 years away. If we took 70 years away from that 876, we'd be right in the center of this distribution. So if some of you can help me if making that correction, I know it's not a year, calendar year, calibrated year, one-to-one relationship. So next slide, I'll finish up with the implication of this assemblages with regard to these small points. Julie will show you a picture of it as she goes through the presentation. It's basically a little end blade from this assemblage. But we have these obsidian sources from south, copper rod from the south, and a radiocarbon date from the eastern lobe. And all of this suggests a downstream dispersal, otherwise a northern distribution or dispersal of people, perhaps out of the plume of the White River east eruption. So, and perhaps a corridor of, a movement of these small end blades into that region, as well as traveling with copper. So I'll stop there, Julie, and let you take over. Thanks.
Okay, so when you see our little bifaces in a minute, you'll know we were thinking, hey, could these be arrowheads? And especially with the dates on Bob's site there. Obviously, we know there was the Atlatl bow and arrow transition in the southern Yukon at about 1200 years ago. And but the thing is, most of those arrows are bone and antler and or copper. Rarely do we see stone arrow points. So we kind of skim the literature looking for small bifaces that could be arrowheads at other sites, and the Yukoners again helped us out with this. There's some smaller bifacial points at Rat Indian Creek, Ray LeBlanc's work up in the Old Crow Basin. There's some that Sheila Greer found right below the White River Ash at Annie Lake. These are looking similar to the ones that I'm going to show you in a second here. And then, of course, Bill Workman found various bifaces above and below the ash, some smaller than others, but some that he thought were arrow points. So Kavik and other various points from the Chimi site. So we looked at the various indices to try to determine if our points could be arrowheads, and the ones on the left here are all from FAI 2743 in the Tanana Flats, and then Bob's end blades here on the right, the David site one. So looking at length, width, and thickness measurements, our artifacts here do fall right into the arrow indices, sort of the original old ones by David Hurst Thomas. But of course, lots of folks have improved on those indices over the years, and Hildebrandt and King have a dart arrow index, which focuses more on the neck width plus the maximum thickness. And so when we, our necks are all sort of different here, but when we look at the neck width versus maximum thickness of these points, they fall more in line with darts. So that was kind of interesting. Even though they're tiny, they're kind of thick. So the purple ones here on the chart, on the graph on the right, are the ones from 2743, and the yellow line here is Bob's end blade from the David site. So his is looking a little more arrowy than the points from the Tanana Flats. We also had speculation that these could be diminutive Chindaden points, and so we looked through Angela's work from the Lindis Point and Healy Lake, and she's got some good measurements there. And again, these points are all on the smaller than the small end of Chindaden points, so we're pretty certain that they're not just Chindaden points. Of course, you've got to look at these artifacts individually, and I'll just go real quick here because we're running out of time, but they've had long use life histories, and when you look at them closely, it looks like A and C here might have been broken points that were retouched on the bases to have another use life, maybe as an arrowhead or a toy, or maybe something different. This middle point here, B, is doesn't look like it was broken and resharpened. It's got nice edge grinding on the base and up the sides here. But again, it's kind of a larger, it's the largest, when it was finished, probably it was the largest of the three, but also the thinnest. And then Bob's end blade here, it's a barely retouched flake. It's got bifacial retouch on both sides, very thin, sort of a more expedient, quick flake. Anything you wanted to say about that flake tool? Sorry.
Just less than 2 millimeters thick, and it was that sequence of flaking down a core was very thin.
So in the end, we don't really know. In some ways, they align more with ILL darts, depending on what index we use. But in some ways, they do look like they could also be arrowheads if we just use traditional measurements. And of course, Bob's thin end blade is quite different than the ones at 2743. So each tool has its unique history. We might not be able to make one functional interpretation for all points, and we're going to continue to explore other tools in the assemblage and stratigraphy. And then we were also hoping to talk to you all and see if you had anything similar, any sort of late Holocene lithic stone points that could help us unravel this mystery a little more. So just briefly then, I just want to thank all the Canadians that we chatted with in our explorations here, Chris Thomas and Bob Daw and Greg Hare and others, and then of course to Jeff Rasic for the Obsidian analysis, and of course, all our organizations for funding and support. So TCC and U.S. Army Garrison, Alaska, and Colorado State University. Bob, anything else?
No, thank you, Julie. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thanks, Julie and Bob. And our next presenter is Doering.
How's that look?
It looks good.
Okay, great. Cool. All right. I guess I'll get going. All right, thanks so much for inviting me and us to give this talk. So this is going to be about ground penetrating radar, auger testing and test excavations in order to establish site extents and activity areas at 3 sites in the Middle Tanana Valley. So just a brief introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of ground penetrating radar and auger testing in Alaska. Then I'll tell you a little bit about why these 3 sites make a good example for how this method could work at other sites in the interior. I'll describe the method, and then I'll share with you some of the results. They're a little preliminary. We're still working on some of the auger testing across these sites, but still there are some, I think, useful conclusions we can draw. And then I'll talk about whether or not a systematic GPR and/or auger survey can expedite excavations. And so in keeping with the theme of the conference this year, which is climate change, I'm interested in understanding how we can basically facilitate our ability to find central activity areas at sites that may be threatened, whether it's by climate change or industrial developments, in order to cut to the chase and get the most data where we can if a site needs to be excavated quickly. So that's kind of the inspiration for this work. So a brief history of GPR and auger testing. Thanks to Barbara Crass and Chuck Holmes for sharing a few of these photos with me that are very illustrative of this in Alaska. So ground penetrating radar is a non-destructive method that helps to identify changes in subsurface density. So archaeologists have used this to identify buildings, rock-lined hearths, living floors, and Tommy Urban has even used this to identify permafrost. Most of the GPR data from Alaska comes from the coast and the Brooks Range, but Urban and Rob Bowman have both done GPR testing in the interior. And if you know of others, I'd love to hear about it because I'm always looking for more data. And essentially this work has shown promise, particularly in identifying subsurface stratigraphy, but we need some additional ground truthing, which is kind of what this augering is all about. So augering, on the other hand, is destructive, which is why some archaeologists try to stay away from it. And I understand that. We can talk about that more, but essentially it is a 3 to 4 inch hole in the ground. This has been used across the Middle Tanana Valley as well at sites like Mead, Holtzman, which is shown here, Jashina or Upward Sun, and the Klein site. This is primarily used as a geological probe. So in these cases, it was used to assess essentially how deep was bedrock, particularly at sites with a lot of deep stratigraphy, and also assessing whether or not there are paleosols, because there's a little window in the auger bucket that allows you to see significant changes in soil coloration, such as paleosols. At Jashina, a more systematic approach was used. So they did a 10 meter by 10 meter set of lines, and that really helped to establish the geomorphology across the site, but it also showed some of the artifact concentrations across the site as well. So this is a method that has been used and does show promise in Central Alaska. Here I'm going to be talking about these 3 sites. They are all multi-component, deeply stratified sites with varying testing extents, and they have unique sort of ecological situations too. So the Bachner site is on Quartz Lake here. The Swan Point site is kind of located in a marshy area now, perhaps near a creek in earlier times. And then Nijaina, which is the traditional name of this site on the Delta Creek. So the Bachner site is a pretty large site that has seen limited testing. It was first identified in 1993 by this bifacial point eroding off of the bluff edge, as well as a 1 by 1 meter test. Carol Galvin Raymiller came back and did some more testing, including some shovel tests across the landform and 2 additional 1x1 meter units on top of that first one. She identified 2 paleosols at 125 and 155 centimeters, and then an extensive collection of artifacts, some of which you see here. And Julie and Bob, you'll notice this small biface. I was thinking about that when you were talking, in this dates to about 2000 Cal BP. So we can talk more about that later too. Nijaina is a smaller site, or rather this locus is a smaller site that has seen moderate testing, and it's on the Delta Creek. This site was first identified in 1978, and limited testing by CEMAL, including tests that I excavated, resulted in paleosols again at about 120 and 150 centimeters below surface, as well as an extensive array of pretty large lithic debitage in pretty distinct concentrations that you can actually see in the site stratigraphy. It is so dense, as well as some nice bifacial projectile point technology from the early Holocene, and some faunal remains from the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene. Finally, a site that needs no introduction, Swan Point, especially because you did such a nice job of talking about it before. So this is a large site with extensive testing in the Shaw Creek drainage. First identified in 1991. Of course, extensive testing has gone on at the site by many different people from the 1990s to the present. And this site has a large block excavation that has revealed numerous dense cultural components spanning human history in Alaska, from one of the earliest, if not the earliest site in North America, up until the very recent pre-contact period. So again, each of these sites, multiple components, well stratified with varying testing extents. So at each of these 3 sites this past summer, we began this sort of combined GPR and augering method. So first, at each of the sites, we established a grid on the largest open area using total station and pin flags. Here you can see the grid as well as the GPR lines that we ran at the Bachner site. We ran the noggin, it's a 250 megahertz GPR on a sled. So we dragged it essentially at 50 to 100 centimeter intervals. So you can see that in the east-west direction, we had slightly wider intervals than the north-south direction. And it's ideal to have both directions exhibited, and I'll show you why in a second. So we also carefully recorded our line numbers and orientations of the lines to identify anomalies in the field and then in post-processing later. And this recording is really key for the processing that I'm going to show you. We also augured at particularly at Nijaina and at Bachner on anomalies that we identified in the GPR data. GPR data requires some post-processing. So I evaluated the individual lines and then interpolated those lines into basically a composite, like a 3-dimensional cube of data that you can sort of slice at horizontal levels to kind of go back through a plan view of the site through time using those GPR data. In both methods, I processed using those things you can see there. And this processing essentially just makes the signal stronger. So you can see on the left, this is unprocessed data. It's got some sort of weak signatures down here at the bottom. Whereas on the right, the processing really helps to flesh out some of those deeper strata here. And what's key here is that it doesn't change the data. It just sort of magnifies the quieter signals, if that makes sense. So here are the results. So I'm going to show you a little animation like this for each of the different sites. And this is basically just to show you the plan view as you go through the auger data through time. And this helped me to pick out horizontal slices at each of the sites, which I will show you. So first I'll give you a little site overview, kind of where testing has taken place in the past and where our auger holes were at these sites. And then I'll show you the vertical sort of individual processed lines where you can see subsurface features. And then I'll show you the sort of horizontal animation of this sort of plan view of the GPR data. So first we have the Bachner site. So you can see the auger testing that we did and two 1 by 2 meter test units that we opened up, along again with this GPR lines that we ran. So basically we ran GPR across this entire area, and then some of these augers that are off grid are on anomalies. So here is one of those processed sort of individual lines in the data. And one of the clearest signatures that we have here at the Bachner site is bedrock. So this red line that I just overlaid on the data is consistent with the bedrock depth that we identified using the auger, as well as Carroll Gelvin-Raymiller's previous tests. The thing that you should look at here, if you want to try to find the anomalies in the data, are sort of significant darker or lighter spots. This indicates a significant change in the sediment density. So here, I identified a couple of those here, and maybe here you can see there's a little bit of a lip or something here, as well as a significant darker spot here. And we'll take these data and go back and test it this coming summer, in fact. So this is pretty exciting, although of course a little qualitative, kind of have to squint to see what's going on here. This is one of the north-south lines, and here again you can see really clearly where the bedrock is situated, as well as potentially some anomalies that may be consistent with archaeological features or changes in soil stratigraphy, or things that we can investigate again with auger testing, as well as test excavations. So that pretty much is that for the line data. Here again is that animation, the animated GIF through time of a plan view. So basically going deeper and deeper and deeper through time. And what I want you to get out of this essentially is that it's not noisy all the time. There are periods that are quieter, like this one, and then there are periods that kind of get louder with more anomalies, which here are in yellow or red. And also, you may notice through time that this area in here seems to be highest in terms of activity through time. So from this, I pulled out a couple of different slices, which I'll show you now. This is at about 60 centimeters below surface. So this is in nanoseconds, because that's how the GPR measures things, but it also estimates subsurface depth as well. So you can see here, there's an interesting sort of yellower spot here, as well as here. And we're conducting a test excavation here that does seem to be consistent with this being a nice some sort of cultural feature, and we'll continue to work on that this summer too. A little deeper, we have this anomaly here, as well as potentially one here. I'm not sure what's going on there, but again, we can do an auger test and see. And then finally, at 175 centimeters below surface, we have an anomaly here, kind of in the center of the GPR area. The interesting thing about all of this is that these depths are also where we have cultural components at the site. So it does seem like the noisier areas in the GPR data are reflecting cultural activity in the past, which could be really useful for identifying cultural activity areas, again, if the ground truthing methods show that this is correct. I also wanted to share with you a little bit of the auger results. So this is basically another interpolation, but based on the number of artifacts, and this is just all artifacts, bone, lithics, etc., that we got out of each of our auger holes. You'll notice that activity seems to be concentrated here, and that's about where it was concentrated in the GPR plan view as well, which is also interesting. These two auger tests are negative, but that's because they ended at about 30 centimeters below surface because we ran into too much fire-cracked rock. So these are negative sort of only in name only, and there's probably a lot more activity going on in these areas as well. So as we go deeper in these two test units this summer and complete this auger grid, I'll refine this and then compare it again to the GPR data. So look forward to that. Here we have Swan Point. This is the central excavation block. There was also an excavation conducted over here. And I'm going to be focusing on this area because it's sort of the most complete in terms of GPR testing. You can see that we have the most GPR data from this area, so it's kind of easiest to see. And so here again, we have one of the lines that runs across. This bedrock layer is a little bit more difficult to see, but I would argue it's about here. And this is consistent with the bedrock depth that we see at Swan Point. And then we have some potential anomalies here and here, which we would like to test in future seasons as well. Here you have that nice animation again through time, going deeper and deeper into the past. This one's a little shorter because this doesn't have as much sediment before bedrock, but you can see again that there are periods that there is a lot of activity in the GPR versus not as much. So this is how I pulled out some of those slices. So here you can see at about 25 centimeters below surface, we have a nice anomaly here, which I would like to test. And then there's this interesting sort of semicircular shape along with another nice anomaly here. So this could be some sort of concentration of activity, or again, it could be some sort of dense stratigraphic level. Here again at 55 centimeters below surface, we see another sort of semicircular feature here, as well as some interesting things going on in this area that we can test. So more to test there, and you'll appreciate that this is a little qualitative, and you really do need to get those auger or shovels out and do some testing in order to assess what this means. Finally, we have Nijaina. This site is much smaller. You can see this is a 4-meter scale, as well as it has been more completely tested in terms of total site area because it is so much smaller. These are 2 units that we put in this past summer. And this area, unfortunately, is so covered in brush that we couldn't really run the GPR along it, which is another consideration if you're bringing a GPR into the field with you. So here's the longest the longest east-west line that we ran at this site. And you can see again, bedrock pretty clearly in the GPR, which is great because this can help us to show where this site is shallower or deeper, which can again help you to direct your excavations. There are some potential anomalies here and here, although this profile overall is a little quieter. And this is reflected also in this animation of that sort of plan view data as you go deeper and deeper through the horizontal record too. And of course, here and here, we weren't able to run the GPR. So because this is the edge of the landform and this was too brushy. So basically the computer did the best it could to interpolate features in this area. And again, there's just not as much going on other than that first level, which is basically just the roots and vegetation at the top. So a little bit less interesting, but there are still a couple of highlights, which I pulled out here. So this is around 50 centimeters below surface. And again, these are not very discrete. These bright white spots would be the anomalies. And I'm not sure how much this means anything. Here you have again at 150 centimeters. And interestingly enough, we have a huge concentration of lithics in this area, but nothing in this auger hole. Whereas this was the least productive unit, and this auger had something like 40 or 50 flakes in it. So the auger testing can definitely help a little bit in terms of assessing site density, but it is interesting to see those variable results. So with that, is it worth it? I'll tell you a little bit about the time it takes to do this. So for Bachner site, which had a 12 by 20 meter grid, it took about 15 hours for us to set up the grid with those pin flags that you can see here around Ken as he's doing the GPR on the sled, and to run all of those lines. With continuous unexcavated areas, GPR works really well to identify bedrock depth and can maybe help us to identify subsurface stratigraphy and features. More on this after this summer, hopefully. And for smaller sites, I would say it's not as useful just because you're not choosing between as large of an area, and it's relatively easy to throw in a couple of test units and get an idea of what's going on at the site if it's not quite as big. The same is true for sites that have been more completely excavated like Swan Point. We kind of have an idea of where the activity is at that site, although there may be some offsite areas that might be interesting to test as well. How about auger testing? So this takes about 30 minutes to an hour, depending on your depth and soil texture. And I would say it does give a pretty good idea of subsurface activity at those different depths. It will take a little bit longer to do a 2-meter grid at larger sites, but it can really help you to zero in on the most important activity areas. So we found a pretty amazing lithic concentration just within the top 50 centimeters at the Bachner site, including this nice unifacial tool, as well as this piece of shaped ochre or ochre crayon. So it was pretty productive, and I'm really glad we went in with the auger, in fact. Just a couple of best practices to wrap things up. I think it's really important to do all of this on a total station grid. Augering at 2-meter intervals seems to be really helpful for identifying those main activity areas, and GPRing in both directions, as well as on a clear ground surface, is very important as well. Another thing I'll say is that when you encounter an obstacle like a downed tree, it's good to end the line before crossing the auger unit and then start a new line afterwards, so you don't have any weird shakes in your auger or in your GPR data. And then, of course, post-processing GPR and auger data in the field can be really helpful for refining your results as you're continuing excavations. So that's kind of that. Thank you so much to all the folks who helped out with this project. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have in the chat or via email. Just let me know. So thanks.
Great, thanks, Bri. And our next presenter is Jennifer Kilhofer.
Hi, everyone. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, how does that look?
It looks good.
Okay, great. Thank you. I am really excited to be here today and to present for you. And thank you so much to François and Gerad for inviting me to be here. And thank you all for being a great audience. So today I'm presenting the results of an organic geochemical analysis done on soil bacterial compounds at 6 early archaeological sites in the Middle Tanana Valley. And from there, after developing a temperature reconstruction using these compounds, we can make some inferences about the relationships between temperature and temperature change through time and early human groups and those that continue to occupy this area. Nope. Okay, sorry. All right, so there are 2 major research motivations for this project. First of all, to reconstruct past climates and specifically temperature here associated with early human occupation of Central Alaska. And this is part of a hot topic of interest and part of a lot of ongoing research in this region. And our contribution to this ongoing work is to develop a new record of terrestrial climate to complement the existing paleoenvironmental records for the area. So this is a more semi-quantitative to quantitative record, applying a novel technique in the organic geochemical realm and really being part of these ongoing multi-proxy efforts that we've seen today. There are 2 major research problems when we're thinking about reconstructing temperatures, both for paleoclimatology applications, geoarchaeological applications in this context. One is there are a limited number of reliable proxies for continental air temperature. This is something that is a global problem and not just a regional one. So there's a search for more and more reliable proxies to actually get at air temperature on land. And then there are also a limited number of terrestrial proxies that can be directly compared to the archaeological record. I'm sure many of you are familiar with our own study region in the Middle Tanana Valley, that a lot of great temperature records come from lacustrine settings. So they're a little bit more challenging to directly compare to the archaeological record. But I'd argue that the technique we've used in this study, which is branched GDGT paleothermometry, I know that's quite a mouthful. This is a really useful technique that should be more widely applied going forward, because you can collect these samples either directly from excavation profiles or stratigraphic sequences nearby archaeological sites. And then you're really getting a nice local record of temperature change through time that you can compare directly to your archaeology. Now, here I'm moving into more of the specific research questions. and looking at some hypotheses that we were aiming to test about temperature change through time. So the first is how much temperature change was there in this region from the late glacial to the Holocene. So starting with the earliest occupations around 14,000 years ago and going to present day, what did temperature look like over the course of that interval? And we know from global trends, we would expect to see cooler temperatures in the earlier part of the record and warmer temperatures in the later part of the record. So we wanted to test the hypothesis that that was indeed the case at these study sites. And then the second question is, what was the magnitude or the degree of deglacial temperature change in central Alaska? So focusing on this interval coming out of the last full glacial period when there was a lot of millennial scale variability in temperature and some of these global climatic events like the Bowling Alrod or the Younger Dryas when you see pretty big temperature swings. So we wanted to assess whether our sites were actually registering these global scale temperature changes. And this is a topic of great interest. So I've tried to highlight that with this upper figure here from Korkorowski et al. 2008, just looking at a variety of proxy data sets across Alaska and assessing whether these show a cooling related to the Younger Dryas or a possible Younger Dryas oscillation versus a more muted response or no response. And that seems to be highly variable across Alaska. So this was an interesting question to look at for our own sites. And then from there, once we have the temperature record baseline, we've looked at temperature changes through time, we can ask the question, did temperature change impact early human groups in the area? Or maybe the lack of temperature fluctuation, did that have an effect? And of course, this has been extensively thought about for decades in our region, thinking about aspects of the archaeological record like technological variability and whether some changes that we see in the Bowling Alrod versus the Younger Dryas, for example, in terms of technological diversity might be related to aspects of the environment and climate and potentially temperature change. We can also think about paleodermography and changes in occupational intensity through time. So again, I've tried to show that a figure from Potter 2008, looking at the distribution of component ages through time, and we can see some swings, some ups and downs in that curve, and those might potentially be related to temperature change. So just trying to tease apart some of these relationships with our temperature record. Of course, we're all familiar now with where we are geographically, but I just wanted to show the actual sites that we looked at for this study. We have 6 sites plotted here. Of course, as Bree said, these don't really need much introduction. They're very well known and well studied, but we've got that cluster of 5 sites in the Shaw Creek Flats area, and then Hurricane Bluff a little bit more southerly in the Delta River Valley, and also a little bit younger in age, only going back to the early Holocene. But that gave us a useful interregional comparison. And here I have a figure that shows the stratigraphic profiles at our 6 study sites, plus Broken Mammoth, which we've correlated to our camp section site. And this is a pretty detailed figure and also one that requires a lot of squinting. So I'll just highlight a couple of features for you. And I show this here because a lot of the ongoing work that's been done at these sites to tease out paleoenvironmental records and dating, this provides really valuable context for a proxy record like our GDGTs. So a couple points just to focus on. One, all the really tiny little numbers, those are radiocarbon dates. So we have very well dated sequences, and then we have great geochronological control with our branch GDGT record, which isn't always the case. So that's very fortunate. And then secondly, you can see how detailed of an understanding we have of stratigraphic changes through time at these sites. So just a huge body of knowledge and lots of data on ongoing work to understand the paleo environments here. So our record fits into this really nicely. And then the next 2 slides, again, I won't go into too much detail, but I just wanted to put a few visuals of what these sites look like, even though many of you are very familiar with them. But we collected our bulk soil and sediment samples from these sites, so it's good to have a picture. And certainly you can see just from the color changes alone that these sites are recording landscape and environmental changes through time. We can see that here with Keystone and Mead, and then Hurricane Bluff in the lower right. So we're getting changes between sediment deposition and soil formation, micro depositional events. Clearly these sites are experiencing environmental changes through time. And we can ask the question, what does temperature look like through time here? How are these sites experiencing temperature conditions and maybe temperature variability? Now moving a little more into the methodology, looking at our technique. I'll just give a brief overview of how branched GDGT paleothermometry works. And branched GDGT is branched glycerol dicol glycerol tetraethers. So certainly the acronym is nicer to say. And you can see these compounds, these are organic compounds pictured in both figures here. You can see that nice branched structure, and they're basically just carbon and hydrogen. But they're membrane spanning lipids that are thought to be produced by bacteria. And they're found in a wide variety of mesophilic or sort of moderate temperature environments. They were first discovered in peats. They're found in bogs, lake water, and ubiquitously in soils across the globe. So they can be very valuable for understanding terrestrial temperature conditions. The guiding principle behind this technique is that microorganisms that synthesize the branched GDGT compounds are adjusting the rigidity of their cellular membrane structures in response to some sort of environmental stress. And in this case, it's temperature change. So they can add components to their core structure. They can add branches or rings as an adaptation to changes in temperature. And the idea also is that they can adapt to cool temperatures or cold temperatures by adding structures and keeping their membranes more fluid, kind of adding space to those structures. So we use that guiding principle then to understand temperature change. And this technique has become increasingly popular over the last couple of decades since these compounds were discovered in 2000 to reconstruct continental air temperatures. And it really represents a big jump in our understanding of past temperature. In this little figure on the left here, I'll just point out that there are three main types of branched GDGTs, and you can quantify the distributions of these compounds, and that's what tells you about temperature in the past. The three main types are separated out by the number of additions to their core structure that they have. So type 1, we have 4 additions. You can count the rings and the branches or the straight lines coming off those core structures. So we've got 4 for type 1, 5 for type 2, and 6 additions for type 3. So that's what's telling us about the response to temperature change. Now, so you've got your bulk sample that you go out and collect in the field, either bulk soil or bulk sediment. And then how do you get your branched GDGTs? It's a pretty involved laboratory and analytical process, but it starts with basically subjecting your bulk sample to an espresso machine, which I've shown here in the lower left. This is called an ACE. And you pack your sample into those metal cells and then subject it to heat and pressure and run some solvents through. And then you end up with sort of a clear or maybe a brown total lipid extract in those vials down below. From there, you can take that total lipid extract, and now you want to separate out the fractions that you're most interested in. So these could be plant waxes, fatty acids, and in our case, branched GDGTs. So you load your sample, your total lipids onto these little columns, and then run more solvents through, and those pull out the compounds of interest. And from there, now that you have your tiny, tiny branched GDGT samples, this is on the order of nanograms, so really small, you would run these using high performance liquid chromatography coupled with mass spectrometry. And so now you can quantify the distributions and concentrations of your branched GDGT compounds. And you can calculate indices that will quantify those distributions for you, and then plug the values of your various indices into whatever temperature calibration you choose to use. And in this case, we've used a Bayesian model called Bay NBT0 to reconstruct past temperatures from our distributions. And we chose this model because it performs best. It seems to have the lowest error compared to a lot of other calibrations out there for samples in cold regions. So it works better for high latitudes. And in this case, we do make the assumption that the bacteria producing our compounds are dormant in the winter when everything's frozen, and they're not actually synthesizing those compounds at temperatures below 0. So it's important to keep in mind that our record is not a mean annual air temperature record, but more like a growing season record, reconstructing mean annual air temperatures above freezing when we assume the bacteria are more active. Now, getting to the heart of this project, we have our results here, or our major results, our branch GDGT derived temperature record. I'll just point out a couple of features in the figure. So in panel A, we have the Greenland Ice Sheet Project #2 temperature record. And then panel B is our GDGT derived record. And panel C is the same record, but it's just separated out by site. So the sites are color coded, just so you can see how each individual site is feeling temperature through time. Oldest is on the right, so I know that varies by presenter, but oldest time is on the right and youngest time is on the left. And these kind of colored shading areas in all 3 panels, the orange sherbet color is the bowling owl rod, and then the blue color is the Younger Dryas, just to help orient us on some of these millennial scale events that are important for understanding. So a couple things. One, with our, now focusing on panel B, with our record, we can see that temperatures are surprisingly stable through time. And this is one of the most important findings of this project, that we did not see a statistically significant increase in temperatures through time that we would expect based on global trends. And we don't see any sensitivity really to these deglacial climatic events. So unlike the Greenland temperature record, where you can see a really nice big drop in temperatures associated with the Younger Dryas, we do not capture that with our sites. They don't really appear to have much of a response to these events. So that was also surprising. And then one more thing that I'll point out, you may be wondering, well, how might you know if these compounds are actually recording real temperature information? One way we can assess that is by looking at the temperatures that we've reconstructed from surface soils that are close to modern and present day temperature data. So we do find a good match between our modern mean annual air temperature above freezing, which is 10.5 degrees C in this region. And we've reconstructed temperatures just above 10 degrees C there. So a really close match that gives us hope that these compounds are recording good climatic information for us. And then the second figure here, again, we have our branch GDGT record in panel A, and we're just comparing to some more local records. So the Greenland temperatures gave us a North Atlantic picture, but now we're getting more Alaska specific in our comparisons, just to see if we're finding good agreement with our branch GDGTs and other existing temperature records out there. And it seems like we are, in the sense that our stable record is matching these trends of relatively flat temperatures through time and relatively stable temperatures through time, especially for the Holocene. And we're capturing that here. So we've got a Chironomid record of July temperatures in panel B from Quartz Lake, which is quite close to our study sites. And then in panel C and D, these are Alaska-wide composite records. But again, showing us pretty flat temperatures. So we've got July temperature anomalies and then mean annual air temperature anomalies down in D. Besides this one little blip in the pollen at the bottom there, these are all quite flat through the Holocene. So again, good agreement with our record and what's already out there, which is always comforting. So I'll conclude just to make one point before I kind of go into the takeaways of the temperature record itself. These branch GTs are a viable, and I would argue a valuable technique for paleo temperature reconstruction, and they haven't yet been widely applied in the high latitudes, most broadly, and at archaeological sites. And I think that this is a really useful approach for answering some questions about past temperatures and human adaptation. So hopefully that came through in this talk, that these could be useful going forward. And then in terms of the temperature results, there are three main takeaways if you don't remember anything else. One would be that we found, because of the lack of cooling in our record, we can say that temperatures in central Alaska were relatively warm during the deglacial. And then other proxy records out there show that they were also relatively warm during the last glacial period in comparison to a lot of other places around the globe. And that's pretty surprising and pretty unique. We also know that this area was never fully glaciated despite the proximity of this massive ice sheet. And that's a really unique situation too, and something that's puzzled researchers for a long time. But our record supports this idea of a uniquely warm condition in this region. And it also supports some modeling results from Laverstrom and Leica in 2016, where they find in their simulations that I've shown here, especially if you look at the lower panel, that LGM temperatures were not very cold in central Alaska. And that was largely in part due to some circulation changes driven by that massive ice sheet, kind of propagating these warm conditions there. So we can say then, if central Alaska was uniquely warm or buffered from extremely cold temperatures, that it may have been a more attractive region for initial human habitation. So if we think about some push-pull factors in terms of environment, that maybe these relatively warm or comparatively warm temperatures might have pulled people into this region to begin with. And then a couple more takeaways from the temperature record. Second one here is that we see a pretty muted response to deglacial climatic fluctuations. So we're not really picking up a big swing in the Younger Dryas, for example, and that temperatures remain relatively stable through time over the entire course of our record. So we have this baseline temperature understanding from our branch GTs, and we can compare that to existing proxy records. And then maybe from there, the archaeological implications are that temperature might not have been a main driver of changes in human occupation and behavior through time, and perhaps some other environmental factor, such as rainfall or moisture availability, had a bigger impact on the flora and fauna, and in turn, the human groups on this landscape through time. So thank you. I appreciate your being here to hear this. And I just want to make sure I show these acknowledgements. There are many, many individuals and organizations that facilitated this work, and it would not have been possible without them. So a big thanks to all of those folks and organizations, and then some very tiny references for you. But I'm happy to answer any questions, or feel free to email me and let me know what you think. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. And we have a 15 minutes break before the next and last presentation in this session. So if anybody has questions for any of the presenters that have presented so far, feel free to ask. I have a question for Bree. Are you here, Bree?
Yeah, I can try to answer it.
Can you see paleosols with GPR?
Possibly, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so Tommy Urban has some unpublished work at McDonald Creek where he's trying to connect the processed GPR data with subsurface stratigraphy and paleosols, and it seems seems possible. Yeah. We will see.
What kind of features do you expect to see, like Earth, for instance? Or?
So I was hoping that we might be able to identify some of those fire crack rock or dense lithic scatter features, things like that, like where the stone is really dense in the deposit. And so we're going to have to go back and again compare the GPR record to the auger test and kind of pull those two things apart and see if they fit. Yeah.
I can't wait to see the results of the ground truthing.
Yeah, I hope it works. At the very least, though, doing the auger grid and using that interpolation, I think, can provide a really nice idea of where a site's main activities are occurring through time as well.
Mm-hmm. Any additional questions? Well, in that case, we will reconvene at 2 p.m. for Don Butler's presentation. Are you still here?
Oh, yeah, I was just about to chat my response there. Yeah, it's sort of a joke, but that's the closest analogy I can think of that would make sense in just common terms. But it's just the idea that you're extracting out some component of that bulkier sample. Hopefully that makes sense.
So it doesn't actually make coffee?
No, unfortunately,
That's
but you can analyze coffee on it. Not as fun. Thanks for the question.
Last presenter today is Don Butler. Don, are you here? I can see you.
Yes, I'm here. Good to see you. Everything's coming through loud and clear?
Yeah, the sound, yeah, we cannot see your slides yet.
So I'll just share my screen.
There you go.
Okay. Slides are up.
All good?
All good to go. All right, great. Thanks a million. So this presentation is going to outline some of our recent progress on the geoarchaeological characterization of Los Paleosol sequences here on the Shaw Creek Bluff. And today I'm just going to focus on the camp section. Of course, this is right next door to the Broken Mammoth site. So before I get going on this, though, of course, I'd like to thank François and Gerad for organizing the session. Of course, I'd thank my co-authors for introducing me to the geoarchaeology of the Shaw Creek Bluff. Thank Ken Severin from the UAF Advanced Instrumentation Laboratory. And of course, I thank the UAF and the Arctic Institute of North America for funding the research. So here we are in an all too familiar location, right near the top of the Shaw Creek Bluff, the camp section, and we're looking out over the Broken Mammoth site and the braids of the Middle Tanana River. So the camp section here, this is about 50 meters above the river, and it's a pretty important archive for contextualizing the local environmental setting at Broken Mammoth, which is just downslope, only about 300 meters away. So we actually have quite a bit of geoarchaeological research done on this sequence. We have a lot of the groundwork laid already. We have all the fundamentals pretty much. We have all the textural data, the pH, the carbonate content, organic carbon content, And now we also have some really nice micromorphological data that provides a lot of new insight into pedogenic processes, organic matter deposition, and even potential disturbances. So really building on this, my first and most basic goal here, the most basic goal of my work, is to contribute to expanding what we know about the local environmental proxies housed in this sequence. And I'm specifically focusing on what we can learn from soil formation processes. So of course, soil formation, this is one of the most important ecosystem supporting services. And because of this, it can tell us a lot about different local processes that shape things like ecological succession, habitat reconfiguration, wildlife provisioning, and of course, ultimately, the factors pulling and pushing foragers across the landscape. And here we have some of the ground level proxies for soil formation that we just don't have yet. But I think we can sort this out pretty quick here in just a few minutes. We can use things like bulk element geochemistry done by XRF. We can use this to get at various processes such as hydrolytic weathering, leaching, and salinization. And this can tell us a lot about shifts from arid to wet conditions and vice versa, of course. Also, mineralogy by Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, scanning electron microscopy, and this can tell us a lot about carbonate precipitation, clay formation, and clay diagenesis. And this can also shed some new light on shifts from arid to wet conditions and vice versa. And we can use soil organic matter and phytoliths, of course, to track changes in local vegetation. So here we have a closer look at the camp section. We know that this is a roughly 2-meter thick sequence of loess deposition and soil formation. So toward the bottom, we have some coarse sands down here. And then we have the loess units, so fine silts blown in. And what we have in here are 3 paleosol complexes that are formed within this loess package. So today we're going to focus on just the bottom 2 here. The lowermost complex we have here, number 3. This is dating to the Balling-Allarod. The date we have for this is 12,730 to 12,520 cal BP. And above this, of course, we have a complex dating to the Younger Dryas. The date for this is about 11,970 to 11,260 cal BP. Macroscopically, both of these packages are pretty similar. They're about 5 to 10 centimeters thick, and they're each comprised of 2 to 3 undulating dark brown organic rich silt stringers. So for the sampling here, I actually sampled 2 different columns down through the entire profile. And I collected 2 samples from each layer in both columns, just like we have illustrated right here for the bottom paleosol complexes. So we have 40 samples in total here. So this should give us some really nice vertical and horizontal resolution to work with here. And we'll just jump right into the results. First up here, we have the down sequence plot for the geochemical proxies. So the first proxy that we have here at data point 1, this tells us about the intensity of hydrolytic weathering. The first, though, before we kind of jump into that, we need to consider the ACNK ternary plot over here, right here on the right. So we can see here that our data corresponds pretty well with the plagioclase weathering trend line. This is really important because it confirms that the proxy is definitely tracking chemical weathering and not compound size sorting. So now that we have that, we can use this to actually track how plagioclase is weathering over time. And this is a really good indicator of pedogenesis, the intensity of pedogenesis. So right here at point 1 in the lowermost Balling-Allarod complex, we can see that both the complex and the parent loess below it, these are both pretty similar. So this tells us that there's no or very little plagioclase weathering represented here. And we just look over a little bit to data point 2. We have the ratio of barium to strontium here. This is a really useful proxy for leaching. This is because barium has pretty strong absorption affinity, while strontium, on the other hand, this is much more soluble. And this is because it has a smaller ionic radius. And we can see that this ratio tracks fairly well with the plagioclase weathering proxy. And this indicates kind of a very limited degree of leaching, particularly here in the Balling-Alarod complex. And moving over again to data point 3, here we have an increase in the geochemical proxy for salinization. And this tells us that what we have here is an accumulation of soluble potassium and sodium salts in the complex. For more support, so these data, these kind of really indicate that there's limited water availability kind of in the system during this time frame. And more support for an arid setting that comes from the pedogenic carbonate and clay archives. So right here at data point 4, we have the SEM image, and this shows us a very poorly crystallized carbonate mineral. Just to the right of this, we have the infrared mineralogical fingerprint. This also tells us that this form of the mineral is actually amorphous calcium carbonate. And this mineral, it's one of the least stable carbonate polymorphs. So its presence in the Balling-Alarod paleosol indicates minor dissolution and reprecipitation owing to limited water availability. And then right here on the bottom at data point 5, we have the SEM image for the clay mineral smectite. So this mineral is pretty unstable under wet conditions with active weathering. And it turns out also that smectite tends to be much more stable in semi-arid grasslands with alkaline soils. So taking all of this together, this evidence for low geochemical weathering, the accumulation of soluble salts, and the persistence of unstable minerals, now this tells us that pedogenesis in this location during the Balling-Alarod is very weak, and this likely mostly owes to local aridity. And this in turn suggests that the landscape likely could not have supported a well-developed vegetation community. So we can also learn about local environments by characterizing the soil organic matter. And right here on the top right, data point 6, we have the molecular fingerprint for the humic substances extracted from the Balling-Alarod paleosol. So humic substances, these are the major organic constituents of soils. And these are produced by microbial decomposition of mostly plant lignin and cellulose. The interesting thing is that their characteristics also are largely shaped by vegetation biomass, temperature, and water availability. The main thing that we can look at here on this molecular fingerprint is something called aromaticity. And this refers to the abundance of closed atom rings coming primarily from lignin. So we can assess the aromaticity using these peaks here, highlighted along the top here. So the interesting thing here is that soils formed under different types of vegetation, these tend to have differing degrees of aromaticity. And in the Balling-Alarod paleosol here, we can see that this has a really low aromaticity based on the height of the hydrocarbon chains present and the low peak for aromatic carbon-carbon double bonds and aromatic carbon-hydrogen single bonds. So what's even more interesting is that this type of fingerprint, this is commonly found in soils formed under grasslands. So we also have some carbohydrates in here. This little shoulder here coming up, indicative of carbohydrates. The presence of the carbohydrates here is actually pretty good evidence for a lower degree of humification. And this is pretty typical of poorly developed soils forming with limited oxygenated water availability. So soils formed under grasses, this is also supported by several correspondents here across the Paleosol molecular fingerprint and this comparative reference sample here on the bottom at 0.7. And this humic substance was extracted from the topsoil forming under a grass field just in Fairbanks. So the Phytolith archive also provides some support for this. We can see that the record here is dominated by grass morphotypes, like this cylindroid echinate, trapeziform polylobate, wavy plates, and rondels. So these morphotypes, these are indicative of cool season mesophytic fluid grasses. What's absent from the assemblages are crosses and dumbbell phytoliths. So these would be indicative of panacoid grasses that prefer warmer and wetter conditions. And there are also no saddles from chlorodoid grasses. These types of grasses prefer warm and dry conditions. And we also know that there are no phytolith morphotypes represented in this assemblage that could be sourced from shrubs and trees. So taken all together, these data are suggestive of a cool semi-arid grassland habitat in the Camp and Broken Mammoth area during the Balling Alarod. And here we have the data from the Paleosol complex formed during the Younger Dryas. So the geochemical proxies here, starting with data point 1 and 2, these show pretty significant increases in both hydrolytic weathering and leaching. And at point 3, we can see that we have a depletion in soluble salts. And we look up to the carbonate, we can also see something very different. Here at data point 4, we can see that this carbonate is very well crystallized. The image shows a very well formed aggregate of layered scalenohedral crystals. And here in the infrared spectra in this fingerprint, we can see that the Ni3 band position here is at 1420 and not 1440. And this indicates that this is a very crystalline calcite. Crystalline calcite is the dominant phase presence in the pedogenic carbonate nodules found in the Paleosol complex here, which is very different from the amorphous carbonate like we found in the Balling Alarod nodules. So this is really, in my mind, suggestive of an increase in water availability and likely longer periods of saturation, both of which favor more complete dissolution and the transformation of less stable phases into crystalline calcite. And then we have the findings at 0.5 here. These show us that the more soluble smectite clay mineral, this is now gone. The dominant clay mineral in this complex is now illite. So together, the proxies provide some pretty decent evidence for improved soil formation. And I would say that this owes to an increase in water entering the system. I would also say that this increase in water should have improved the vegetation cover in the area. And here we have the molecular fingerprint for the humic acid extract to help us sort that out a little bit. So compared to the Balling Alarod fingerprint, what we can see here is a significant decrease in the aliphatic hydrocarbons and an increase in the aromatic ring structures here and here. The higher aromaticity here is suggestive of afforestation in the camp locality. So higher aromaticity, this is common in forest soils because the cycling of aromatic carbon is much slower. The fingerprint we have here at 0.6 and 7, these also compare favorably. And this lower reference here, this was extracted from soils from an area with a mix of grass, herbs, and birch. It's also important to note that the increased aromaticity is also related to an increase in the plant biomass introduced into the system. And this was likely caused by the better development of vegetation communities. But it was also could have been caused by increased humification owing to an increase in the availability of oxygenated water. So the shift in vegetation at the camp locality during the Younger Dryas This is also supported by the phytolith assemblage, and this is when we really start to see the appearance of phytoliths from woody plants. So here are two examples of these types of phytoliths. On the top here, we have what's called a spheroid rugulate, and these come from wood and bark. And on the bottom, we have a trachid, which comes from the leaves of woody plants. It's also important to highlight, though, that grass phytoliths are still the most dominant morphotypes represented in the Younger Dryas Paleosol complex. So what we have here really looks like a mixture of grassland, shrubs, and possibly even open woodland. Also, the phytoliths are far more abundant in this Paleosol, which provides some additional support for local improvement in vegetation biomass. So these multi-proxy results track pretty well with some aspects of previous geoarchaeological research done at the camp section. We have some really great recent micromorphological work done, and this proposes that both late glacial paleosols were pretty weakly developed. So our results from the Bowling-Allarod complex, of course, confirm very weak pedogenesis and a cool, unstable, semi-arid grassland habitat, as again is indicated by low geochemical weathering, the presence of soluble salts, smectite and calcite, along with weak humification and an abundance of grass phytoliths. So this corresponds pretty well with the micromorphological findings for weak pedogenesis, and this was indicated by sparse calcite coatings, a few calcified roots, and the presence of organic matter showing differing degrees of humification. But on the other hand, the new proxies do provide some diverging evidence for pedogenesis during the Younger Dryas. Here we have seen increased geochemical weathering of plagioclase. We've seen the loss of soluble salts, the loss of smectite, precipitation of highly crystalline calcite, and very strong humification. These all together indicate improved pedogenesis, and I would argue that this improved pedogenesis largely owes to increased water availability and landscape stability during the Younger Dryas. So the findings also diverge somewhat from regional models for vegetation change in the interior. So we have the pollen archives, and these tell us that forbs, sedges, and grasses were largely being replaced by shrubs and birch between about 14,000 and 13,000 cal BP. And at the beginning of the onset of the Younger Dryas and throughout, we see the return of sedges and grasses. And what we're seeing at the camp section, though, is some local diversity represented here. What we're seeing is a strong phytolith signal for grass-dominated vegetation community during the Bowling-Allarod, and we see a shift to mixed grassland, shrub, and possibly open birch woodland during the Younger Dryas. So to conclude, the findings really contribute to expanding our multi-proxy data sets, and we need these data sets to continue building our understandings of relationships between local habitat change, wildlife resource structures, and of course, forage or settlement subsistence strategies. The data, it provides some support for the hypothesis that the Bowling-Allarod habitat at the camp locality was in an early stage of development, and it likely couldn't sustain sizable populations of large-bodied mixed grazers, browsers. Of course, the paired archaeological record here of Broken Mammoth provides some support for this. As we know, the faunal assemblage here from this time frame is comprised only of only 5% wapiti and 2% bison. On the other hand, the Younger Dryas, the representation of bison and wapiti increases dramatically during this time frame. And we've seen from the geoarchaeological evidence from the camp section, this suggests the development of a more stable grass and shrub habitat that likely attracted more bison and wapiti into the area. So I think to sort this out a bit more thoroughly, what I'm going to need to look at is I'm going to need to improve my understanding of whether these differences in herbivore representation is a function of site seasonality or a function of resource availability owing to changes in local habitats. So I'll leave it there for now. That's about it. So thanks a million.
Right, thanks, Don.
You're welcome.
Are there any questions for Don? or for any of the other presenters before him. I don't see any movement here. So I think we can close this session. I'd like to thank all the presenters for joining this session and everyone who attended as well. And yeah, I am looking forward attending the other sessions at this conference.